Morning. I'd like to call the meeting for the Finance and Operations Committee to order at this time. We do have a full agenda today. Hopefully we can move through as quick as possible, but we've got a lot of business that has to get done. We're going to start off today on the annual report on employee compensation. I believe President Keeler, would you like to say a few words before we have Vice President Brown?
Thank you, Chair Anderson. I would indeed. This is one of the most important things we work on and we worry about at the University of Minnesota. There are a few things that are more significant to our mission than recruiting and retaining strong faculty and staff. And an important part of doing that, of course, is providing appropriate compensation. And we have spent a great deal of time, in my time as president and Vice President Brown's time in human relations, understanding how to benchmark what we do against the markets with whom we compete, and lining up the best total compensation package available for our faculty and staff. And so what Vice President Brown and Senior Director Horstman will do today is show you how we do that. And I think you will see the fruits of a considerable amount of work, a careful consideration of those with whom we compete for talent, and an understanding of how we reward our employees for the important work that they do. So with that, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, President Keeler. Always great to see you, Vice President Brown. Thanks for all you do for the university. Senior Director Horstman, good to see you sitting there. I'll just let you two take over. Go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Chair Anderson, members of the committee. Good morning. We're pleased to be here today to share background on our compensation program and help you deepen your understanding of how our compensation program works. There are two big questions that always come up for a governing board in the area of the compensation. And the first is the overall spend for compensation appropriate in the total budget. The answer to that question is the university has consistently spent around 61 to 2% over many years, probably the last 15 years, of its budget on total compensation. And of course, the total dollars increase as the amount of the budget increases. But that percent of spend has been very stable. This indicates that we aren't facing an upward trend in the cost of compensation, rather we're in a stable situation. Which brings us to the second question, and that is really, are we spending the compensation dollars in the most effective way that we can? Are we able to recruit and retain faculty? Are we able to recruit and retain talented staff? And the answer is in this presentation, which focuses on base salary and merit compensation. This graphic illustrates that our U of M priorities should be the primary consideration when determining the appropriate size and mix of our current and future workforce. Total compensation, which includes base salaries and benefits, is an outcome of these priorities and workforce decisions. Total comp has consistently been about 61 to 62% of the university's budget, and ultimately flows through to the budget on the right-hand side of this illustration. Although a significant expense, total comp is also a required investment that supports the recruitment and retention of highly qualified faculty and staff. Historically, we have determined how much we can add to base salaries solely based on whether there was sufficient new money in or reallocated money in the budget to create a compensation pool. We are moving toward a model where we set base salaries and we look at how important an annual merit increase pool is based on the competitive marketplace. We would like to suggest that any budget source shortfall then can be resolved by continually reassessing our priorities and workforce needs. Your own policy sets forth our overall compensation philosophy. We state that our goal is to provide compensation that is market competitive and that attracts and retains a high-performance workforce. One of the most significant changes in support of this philosophy occurred very early in President Keeler's tenure, when he emphasized the principle that an employee's annual salary increases should be based on merit. Since that time, we have tried and implemented to establish an annual merit increase percentage that is both competitive with the external market, falls within our ability to pay, and is distributed based on an employee's personal performance. You can see that the Board of Regents policy has a dual focus of compensation as an expense as well as an investment. From an expense perspective, we have to consider what we can afford, but adding the additional perspective of compensation as an investment leads to more effective compensation strategy. With this perspective, you begin to ask yourself, where should you invest your limited resources? Which positions are critical to our success over the next few years? How are we paying relative to market for those positions? Do our pay programs deliver the greatest increases to those who are the strongest performers? To go back to this illustration, when you start on the left, you really look at what are we trying to accomplish, what types of skills do we need, how many people do we need. That determines how much we spend overall in compensation, and that fits into our budget. Focusing our limited compensation resources in this manner will allow us to recruit and retain high-performance employees to achieve our mission. So how does this compare to the private sector? In the private sector, they have more levers. They can eliminate a non-profitable aspect of its business. They can start a new business line to generate a new stream of revenue. They can seek venture capital, sell stock, employ a myriad of other business strategies to meet overall business and operating objectives. These options are not available in higher education, where we have two primary funding levers, tuition and state funding in the public sector. Research dollars are also a factor, but are focused in nature and have limited use. Workforce decisions and changes are also easily, or more easily, I don't want to say overemphasize this, accomplished in the private sector. Most times they have employees who are at will, which means transitioning their workforce can take place in a relatively short order, depending on their own internal policies. Public education has tenure and other policies for non-faculty positions, which requires us to turn the ship slowly. We must give faculty and staff notice, and in some cases due process, before severing their employment. A final difference is private sector usually has more centralized decision-making. They are often more top-down. In higher education, we have more decentralized decision-making, which is the function of both the culture and the scale of our institution. This is not an institution of a single business, but really many businesses that come together. Total compensation is an integral part of the university's employee value proposition. Once we have determined the workforce needed to deliver on our key priorities, we need to focus on how to effectively recruit and retain employees. Total compensation is integral to this. Compensation, as you see, is at the base of the pyramid. Circled at the bottom are base pay and merit increases. What differentiates the U is our mission, and the more connected faculty and staff are to the mission, the more engaged they are. And the information items in the meeting today are the high-level results for the employee engagement survey. Overall, they are very positive. Higher engagement means more productive employees, as illustrated by the arrow on the right. Supporting engagement is one of the most critical actions we can take to ensure productivity and support the retention of our quality employees. Another key action is to evaluate performance. That can be rewarded then with merit increases, which illustrate how the tool of compensation completes the circle. Investing in top performers is a good strategy to maximize the impact of the compensation dollars that can be spent. Again, guided by Regent policy, determining competitive pay levels for an employee first occurs at the time of hire, but is then monitored throughout employment. The following factors illustrated on this slide are considerations. The final consideration on this slide, but certainly not the least, is what the market is paying for a particular job. The relevant market is different for different employee groups and jobs. This slide lists our different employee groups. In the gray shaded box, professional and administrative and civil service are two employee groups that are addressed by job families. How we define the market varies by each employee group. For example, the market for faculty is generally national higher education, sometimes an international market even. The market for other employees is more local, usually the metropolitan area or the upper Midwest region. To determine the market, you have to understand where we hire from and where departing employees go. That helps us then focus on the relevant geographic regions and industries that we should consider when establishing our salary midpoint ranges. Again, to illustrate, different employees groups have different markets. Faculty often come from academic programs, other universities. We obtain faculty straight out of graduate school programs. We recruit them from other universities. They usually move on to other universities, sometimes even metro area hospitals where they're very highly compensated and do well in that arena. We also have international recruitment. So faculty is often very dependent on the academic discipline. Some more regional, some more national, some more international. For example, a family physician is a different market than a neurological surgeon. So everything has to be focused on what the job is and what is the appropriate market. For IT employees, as well as most of our professional administrative staff and our civil service staff, we look to the Twin Cities geographic region and private industries in that region. We are finding we obtain most of our talent from private industry in the area, and when they leave, they are usually going back to private industry. The job family work helps us manage the relevant markets. It allows us to consider different markets for our employees. It provides data on which we can make decisions where before we lacked data. I'm going to turn this over to Ken and let him walk you through the presentation regarding the use of job families in setting compensation.
Thank you, Kathy. Chair Anderson, committee members, our job families allow us to consider the different markets for our employees, and it provides data on which we can make decisions where in the past, prior to having the job family structure, we lacked the data. The university's civil service and professional and administrative employees are classified within the job families, as Kathy mentioned. This covers roughly 11,200 employees, or 49% of the university total payroll. Job families are broad, distinct functions that contain a group of subspecialty jobs engaged in similar work that require similar knowledge, skills, and abilities. The current job families are listed on this slide as an illustration of the categories of the different work. To get a better view of life before the job family, we can go back a few years on the left hand of this slide and look at one particular classification at that time, coordinators. In this classification, we had approximately 1,000 people at one time. This became a catch-all class for any time you were not sure what class to use. Put them in the coordinator position. It also did not have a set salary range, so a well-meaning hiring manager may need to provide their own anecdotal evidence on the market to make a reasonable job offer or even arrive at that in a discussion with the desired candidate, rather than having a discipline of paying what was a fair market price based on data. There was no identification of who was a supervisor and who was not, which led to reporting challenges. Fast forward to our current state with the job families, we now have differentiated columns for supervisors and individual contributors. We have market-based pay ranges based on the type of work, which allows us to manage our hiring and retention efforts in a planful manner. To determine how we are paying relative to market, we use a measurement called a comp ratio. This simply indicates how closely the salaries for an individual or a group of individuals in a job class compare to the salary range midpoint, or market median, another term for describing the midpoint. The midpoint is a very close approximation to what is being paid in the market for a particular job. For instance, a comp ratio of 1 would exactly match the market median or midpoint. If you had one of 0.8, that would be 20% below the midpoint, and 1.2 would be above the median. You cannot know if a person's comp ratio is appropriate unless you also understand the person's performance and job mastery. There are other factors involved in making a decision regarding a specific employee or job level. For instance, outstanding performers could exceed the range midpoint, where those who may be new to their roles or learning their roles may be closer to the minimum of a range. Because we have implemented the job families, we are able to create pictures that show how our pay compares to the market for each family. This graph summarizes comp ratios for our administration job family. The salary range for a given level is in the gray bar. The average annualized U of M base salary is the gold triangle, and the midpoint to the market is the maroon circle. This particular job family has 8 levels of classifications. Not every job family has 10, but they may have that if enough jobs exist across the levels. As you can see, the comp ratios for salaries in different levels do vary from the overall comp ratio average of 0.97. For instance, level 5 is below the market median at 0.88, whereas level 9 is 1.02. There are a couple of cautions when looking at these and immediately arriving at decisions. A comp ratio can help identify high-level patterns, but doesn't tell you for certain if you have problems with pay. For instance, level 9, which is exactly on market, if it had 10 people in it, may have 5 who are close to the minimum and 5 who are close to the maximum. No one may be at the market median. And that may be okay, but you don't know that without knowing performance and job mastery. Similarly, the comp ratio for level 5 may be fine if there are several new employees or other factors that would warrant pay slightly below the market. Another caution is, like many compensation structures, we do age our data and do not refresh it annually. So in the data we are looking at today, it has been aged 2% a year, and if the market for that particular job family has moved greater than that, our comp ratios may be on the conservative side. Just to give you a feel for several other job families as we move along, these we will look at the athletics, education, and student services job families. In each of these families, you can see that the individual level does again vary from the collective comp ratio for the family. In the athletics job family, you will find jobs that support our university mission, such as athletic operations manager, athletic operations professional, coach, assistant coach, head coach, performance professional, and trainers. As we move into education, you will find program managers, program specialists, and program associates, as well as a director level. And then in student services, you will find this one uses almost all of the levels across the job family with 9 different levels, but contains many of those support services and management jobs that support our students, such as admissions counselors, career counselors, admission associates, one-stop counselors, and program specialists. We are now working to differentiate our job family titles further to reflect the type of specialty work being performed within each family. For example, currently we have a financial professional 2, which you can see in the gold bar under the current state. That has a given current midpoint that covers all the jobs in that level. However, we can differentiate the jobs within that level, which can have markedly different midpoints. If we look at the ongoing work, accounts receivable, cost accounting, and financial planning are all professional jobs in the professional 2 level that have very different midpoints from the overall job family they are in. Each one of these roles is paid quite differently to market, and by understanding what roles we have within the university and who occupies these roles, we'll be better able to provide more information about our workforce. And we'll know if we are paying a fair and competitive salary for the work being done by providing more refined reporting. More differentiation improves management by allowing us to understand and manage our workforce. It allows us to prioritize our greatest needs in a time of limited resources. It helps us respond proactively to skill shortages and provide up-to-date market data for timely management decisions. In this process of differentiating our job families, we are also discovering that we can reduce the number of salary ranges that fit all 11,200 employees. Currently, at the end of the job family project, we arrived at 260 salary ranges, which was a great situation to be in at the time. But as we have worked initially on this differentiation and job refinement project, we have been able to improve that to the point where this isn't on a slide, but when we go forward and have this implemented, we will have 32 salary ranges, and we will be able to put all 11,000 plus jobs in this hierarchy, which, if you look at training of management and supervision and allowing them to have a streamlined idea of how to implement this in their hiring and management practices, allows them to understand our compensation philosophy much more deeply. Will also allow us to have data-driven decision-making. Differentiation also supports better identification of areas that, along with compa ratio data, may have high turnover and be difficult to fill. Every organization has areas like this, whether you're in higher ed or the private sector. And similarly, almost all employers have a limited ability to make corrections, especially all at once. You need to prioritize. By using a heat map or a similar tool to what we have on this slide, you can distinguish which job families may have critical retention in higher situations due to factors which include compa ratios. Along the vertical axis, we show which job families are above market by 5%, within 5%, and below 5%. Along the horizontal axis, we have anecdotal information that supports the turnover challenges in these positions after discussions with our talent acquisition group. And if you look at those positions and job families that are represented in large cap print, those are the ones that we find are hard to fill in the market. When we go through this analysis and look at high turnover, below market by 5% and hard to fill job families, we arrive at finance and research as being two critical areas that we should focus on. And as we look at our talent acquisition group, one process improvement area they focused on this year was a streamlined process across the university for hiring financial professionals, which has been greeted with a lot of positive response from our colleagues in the departments. A recent Korn Ferry publication, which states that finance and research are two of the top 10 most difficult jobs to fill, also confirms that many times what we're experiencing at the university as a challenge may be, in fact, a market-wide situation. So if we look at how a practicing manager might put this information into play, we have a simple scenario to play out. Again, going to our finance example, we have accounts receivable, cost accounting, and financial planning and analysis. While the compa ratio is low for both receivable and accounting, turnover is high in cost accounting, and it is a particularly difficult area to fill for this manager. If this manager has 10 employees, the cost accounting workload increasing in the department, the manager knows the skills of his 10 employees and can compare them to the market data that we can provide. He can determine the need for another cost accountant, and then he can also collaborate with his HR professional on what is the turnover in this job class across the university. Is this an area of high demand, and how difficult will this be? He can make a well-informed workforce planning decision rather than managed by the seat of his pants. Now I will turn it back to Kathy there we go.
Another way to avoid the, quote, managed by the seat of your pants problem is our new system, the PeopleSoft 9.2, allows us to have desktop information that previously we did not have. So when we upgraded, supervisors are able to see more data at the touch of a button. If they actually look at managers' info in the left-hand window of this slide and you click on that, I can see all of my direct reports. I can see what they're paid, other information about them. So really, no matter where I am, if I get a call and somebody says I have an offer from another place, I can look at that information quickly and assess whether I need to make a retention offer, whether that person is in a competitive pay range already, a variety of information. So this is helping managers use data to make decisions. I want to turn our attention just for a moment to merit pay increases, and those are decided by local units or colleges, and it's based on merit. We also have equity, in-range, and market adjustment. These key tools are what we have to keep our salaries competitive with the market. Regardless of what term is used, they generally refer to the same thing. Merit increases are given each year and vary based on an employee's performance. Equity adjustments are given periodically if more parity in the salary is required for individuals who are doing similar work with a similar level of performance. In-range or market adjustments are given when an employee's pay or group of employees' pay falls behind market. Generally, that occurs when the market has moved significantly, leaving salaries of current employees behind the market. And probably the best indicator of that is something called salary compression. When you hire a new employee in, what you have to pay for that person can sometimes exceed what some of your current employees are making, suggesting that our current structure is behind the market. These can be difficult to manage in the short term because they require additional influx of funds to try to bring those people up. So on an annual basis, we look at the merit increases, and the equity, in-range, and market we look at as needed and take those from funds separate from the annual compensation pool. The annual merit award, if, for example, the pool this year is 2%, that does not mean every individual gets 2%. Again, based on individuals' performance evaluations, you may have top performance and you may have people who are in corrective action or development plans. And this is just a mathematical example of how that can work out. You can have a person making 0.5, one making 3.5, and all the range in between. And when you add that up, that still yields a 2% pool. So we want you to be assured that the merit factor is being considered throughout the institution and being applied. Again, that goes to the most effective use of our compensation dollars is when we are rewarding our best performers. Some ongoing challenges to good compensation decision making. We continue to move more towards strategic decisions while managing the budget. That's a constant tension in any compensation analysis. We continue to utilize and improve our performance management tools and improve the skills of our supervisors and our leadership to manage better around these principles. Data integrity, or data accuracy more specifically, is always a challenge as data is entered across the system. So the better data we have, the more accurate information we have for decision making. We constantly strive to figure out what are the most meaningful reports for supervisors, managers, and leadership that will actually help them as they're working through their compensation decisions. And then there's always an ongoing review of markets and equity. As Ken said, we age the data in some years because it's simply too time-consuming and too costly to do market analysis for every employee across the university every year. So that's a rolling process that takes a couple of years to get through everybody, but is an ongoing process and should be in every organization. With that, we will stop and respond to any questions you may have.
Thank you, the two of you. That kind of a robust report on how you do this. It's interesting to see that.
Thank you.
You're not letting grass grow under your feet, evidently, at Human Resources. I thought we'd open this up. Does anybody have any questions about the compensation situation and want to discuss what Vice President Brown and Senior Director Horstman brought before us? Regent Omari.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. This is complex, so thanks for breaking that down. Is it safe to look at the job family numbers as it goes from 1 to 10, that a 1 is an entry level or lower level position, and then they?
Yes.
Is that how
Yes.
we're reading that? Okay. And so I'm trying to do what you said we can't do, which is draw conclusions from looking at the charts. And so I need help in doing that, because I think some obvious conclusions that one could draw if we look at athletics job family, for example, entry level 1 and 2s are 0.76 and 0.79. Coaching salaries are above market. Not by much, but still above market. And then I flip to education. Oh, no, sorry. Student services, none are above market. And then I go to communications and the backup slides, and none are above market. So, one, again, I'm doing what you told me not to do, but I don't know what else I can take from this. So student services, being that none are above market, very concerning. And then athletics, if I'm drawing some conclusions that are incorrect about how we're taking care of or not taking care of our entry-level employees, or maybe graduate student assistants or what have you, but perhaps overpaying top administrator or coach. So help me interpret, please.
Vice President Brown.
Yes, Chair Anderson, Regent Omari, members of the committee. Again, you're right. We caution you against drawing any big, broad conclusions from this. The areas that you have selected are often popular. For example, working in athletics is a highly sought-after opportunity, so there's a very large number of candidates in the pool. Oftentimes, student services also, there's a large number of candidates in the pool. That can mean that you're, again, not in a difficult field to position, so you often don't need to pay as much to get a quality hire in those positions. The other thing is, because of that, there's often a lot of entry-level people that come into those roles who, as Ken described, would probably be in the lower end of the market range. So you wouldn't necessarily conclude that this is a big problem that they're all below, because if they're employees just entering the field, less experience, less skill sets, they're likely to be in the lower end of the market. And we find in all of those areas, people come in, they get 2-3 years of experience, they bump up to another opportunity either here or at another institution. It's a great honor and privilege to work at the University of Minnesota, and many people desire to do so. And that's one thing we actually do for the profession, is help train young professionals and then give them the start to move on.
Regent Omari.
If I may, Chair Anderson, but I'm still struggling because we're comparing to the market. So we're saying we don't. The market, I imagine, in student services is in high demand everywhere, not just here. Particularly if we're benchmarking against that market, and even looking at the level 10, that's a 0.74 which I imagine is the higher folks in student services who do have lots of experience. So I'm struggling, and maybe we can have a different conversation offline, but I would imagine that whether a lot of people want to work in student services or not, student services should be of the utmost priority. Therefore, we should pay talented people at or above market if we're able. But I get it. It sounds like we're just going off of economics and letting the market play out and supply and demand.
Senior Vice President Brown.
Chair Anderson, Regent Amari, another factor that does play into this is geographic location. The Twin Cities is a very desirable place to live. There are many universities around the country that are more remote locations, a little less desirable. There's so many factors that play into this. Did you want to add something, Ken?
Yes, Chair Anderson, Regent Omari, and committee members. I think, to your point, and I'm not using this as an excuse, it is hard to draw a conclusion. I can see where the perception comes in. You can look at one of these ranges and one of these levels and see that our base salary is below market, but you don't know the background of how the hire was made, if it was someone newer in their career in that position, what the demands in the marketplace were at that time. And I think as you look at through this, if you have questions, our team could actually dig into a few things to provide some examples as a follow-up that might help better answer your questions more completely.
Thank you. Regent Hsu.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. Thank you for the presentation. I think we need to keep in mind, though, that we started talking about total comp, yet all of these slides are focused on, basically salary, base salary. And so it would be nice to, at some point in time, get the capability or the ability to get the data that shows us how we compare on a total comp basis, because we do have very nice benefits here compared to some private industry. And if you're comparing to that, then you're kind of losing some of the information that you need by just looking at base salary. So I don't know if that's something that's planned or if that's even something that we have kind of available to us. The other point I'd like to make is, I don't know how old this data is, but it'd be nice to know, because if you're aging it at 2% a year and inflation's only 1%, then, all of a sudden our numbers aren't really necessarily where they should be, in terms of the midpoints.
Chair Anderson, Regent Hsu, thank you for the question. First, in regard to total compensation, and this may not completely answer your question, but as you know, every June we do a report on our benefit structure and provide that, and we can certainly look at that as an opportunity to talk about that piece of total compensation. In regard to inflation, when we look at the increase in pay in the market, we look at what other peer institutions and private employers that we benchmark against are doing for their own salary actions, and what we find is the market has been moving at about 2.89% a year. Most recently, in the Big Ten, while we don't have a lot of information in this year, even institutions that did not provide an increase last year, one reported in, and they're going to be recommending a 4% this year to catch up. So inflation is certainly an important thing to keep in mind, but what other peers are doing is even as important or more so.
Thank you.
Chair Anderson, Regent Hsu, members of the committee, another thing I'd like to say is that research shows that base salary is very important to employees. And while benefits are important also, most people start the conversation with, what's your base salary? What are you making? And the benefits piece applies differently to different persons. Young people are less concerned about retirement benefits, whether they should be or shouldn't be. That's the reality of the situation, and the research proves that. Healthcare is more important at different ages and different stages of your family and career and so forth. So while benefits are a main contributor, they still don't completely persuade someone to come to a job. An individual will always look at the base salary.
Thank you. Regent Beeson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, presenters. I'm glad to see that the job family study is, in fact, really helping you organize your thinking and useful from a management standpoint. You made a reference to the what you call the moment of hiring. So really, that's the most important set of decisions we make around here or anywhere is hiring people. It locks in compensation, puts people on a trajectory. It has all sorts of obvious and unanticipated consequences to the organization. So the training and the quality of the hiring is really everything that happens around here. I was going to suggest, and you talked, Vice President Brown, about the differences between the private sector and the university. I would contend that in some ways there's less difference, and in some ways there should be less difference. And I would encourage you, I don't know if you're active in any HR peer groups. And if you are, I think those are really useful for whomever in your department to understand the best practice coming out of these organizations. I would also consider an advisory committee of private sector and public sector HR professionals. This model has worked well on the debt and the investment side. Regent Powell's talked about it on the research side. I think there's just so much learning and growth that can happen, sharing of information. You take what you need to, but nobody expects us to look completely like a large corporation. But and that has a lot of other benefits as well.
Thank you.
Make a reaction to those comments, Mr. Chair?
Do you have a reaction, or do you want to move on from that?
Chair Anderson, Regent Beeson, members of the committee, I participate in a couple of groups, which are human resource groups here in the Twin Cities. I'm also chair of the National AAU Chief Human Resource Officer Group. And Ken is very active in benefits groups here in the Twin Cities. So we completely agree with you. We learn a lot from those groups and think that they contribute greatly to our knowledge and our practices.
Thank you. I was just chuckled because you got to understand how my mind works, which my wife would tell you it doesn't. But I was saying we've got a lot of people here that want to get in their 2 cents worth, so I'm going to try to get it. And I just thought to myself, we're talking about inflation. I've been saying 2 cents worth for 50-some years, and it hasn't went to 3 cents worth yet. So, but we do have a lot that want to get in their 2 cents worth. So, Regent Powell.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. So I also want to thank you, Vice President Brown and Senior Director Horstman for the work. I think the move that you've led over the last several years to job families, to compa ratios, to anchoring it in differentiated job families, and increasing use of PeopleSoft, I think is really positive, given the size of the payroll. Which I think is well over $2 billion, which I'm sure is top 10 for the state and maybe top 5. I think that the rigor that you're bringing to this it's entirely appropriate. I mean, we have to be very, very good at this. So a couple of quick suggestions and then maybe a question. The first thought is, the peer set concept and use of that data, I think, is really central to all of this. And the suggestion would be that the board should probably look at that peer set. We should probably have a regular review of that. That would be sort of standard fare for other large institutions with total compensation even far less than what we have. So who's in there, I think, is really important, and so probably worth explaining the rationale for that and allowing the board to debate that on some regular basis. And then I think maybe just a couple of questions. And the first one is, Vice President Brown, you talked about the challenges of decentralized decision making, and so I guess the question is, what are the challenges and how well are we controlling those? Because I think that a lot of the approaches and techniques that you're using here are really sound and stand up well, but you're only as good as how well you're able to deliver, on the compensation approach. And I know there are challenges because of the decentralization of the institution. So the first question is, how are we able to manage that? I think that's really critically important. Then the other question is, I know we've got 50% on job families now. I think you said 49 or 50. Can we get, more would be better, I think. Is there a limit on how high we can go in terms of the percentage of employees who are managed, under, this set of guidances? And then I'll just conclude by saying I think Regent Beeson's idea of an advisory group is an extremely good idea.
Vice President Brown, do you have any comments?
Yes, Chair Anderson, Regent Powell, members of the committee. I'll take your last question first, if you don't mind. The employee groups are set in board policy. Faculty are the first group. The job family structure doesn't really work effectively for that group. And they have basically an assistant professor, an associate professor, professor. Mm-hmm. Those salaries are very much set by the academic discipline. Mm-hmm. And we do work with the provost office to do appropriate compensation data, provide compensation data in areas of academic study. Those salaries are much less conducive to being put into some type of a structure. Mm-hmm. Given the expertise may be unique, the experience the contributions unique, and so forth. So those don't fit very well. So the P&A and civil service are in. The graduate assistants are another job group. They're a very standard group. They're really all the same. So again, the job family group doesn't really apply to them, is not needed to measure their salary. For the labor folks, we have essentially done this kind of work already in our labor contracts, and that has been in place and is very typical in labor contracts. That has been in place in our contracts for as long as we've had them, so many years. So that work is being done. We didn't talk about that here today because that's all subject to negotiation. So, but it works in principle in the same way, that it's simply more seniority based in the labor contracts.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. The first question you had was about the challenges of decentralization. And I think we've been really fortunate to have very good leadership across our campus. But this work that we're doing is relatively new in origin. It's just been the last 5 years or so that we've really turned the corner on that. So what we are doing is two things primarily. We're doing a lot of supervisory management leadership training, help them understand how to use this information effectively for their own decision making, and that's an ongoing process. And probably the most effective thing we do is create a network of the human resource function by using HR leads in each one of our colleges and units. We meet with them monthly. We talk. They've been integrally involved in this work. They understand it. They've been big supporters of it. We meet with them monthly to help them understand what we're doing in human resources. We really use them as our allies to help inform local decision makers about what we need to do. And I think that is in large part going very effectively in this. What we're trying to do in human resource overall is tie all the pieces together. As Ken said, we've tried to do expedited search processes for areas like finance where we have high need, get those people in, use our job markets, use good performance evaluation, good leadership training so those folks are well managed, and trying to build a whole system so that all these pieces are working together.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vice President Brown. Regent Swigum.
Mr. Chairman, may I humbly say that not only should you not check only with your wife, but I think around this table, vote on your mental capacity.
Okay.
You might be in trouble, Mr. Chairman. So it's not just your wife. If I could, I feel like the farmer that just got overwhelmed with information by every seed corn company that has the data and information that says their seed corn is the best. And that's the way I feel right now. I did a little minimum research, partly with Regent Powell and certainly with our staff last year regarding comparisons in the market being a county government and state governments. And, I know that Mr. Horstman talked about peer institutions and the private sector. I think our market comparison is more state government and county governments, I would say, at least in a regional basis around here. That's probably not true for faculty that we recruit around the country. And by the way, I want to pay our people really, really well. And I want to pay them adequately, and I want to pay them competitively. But in the minimal research that I did last fall, which will continue, it seemed to me that we were paying significantly greater than at least state of Minnesota salaries in comparable job families and county governments. If you would turn to page 20 that you gave us, the administration job family. And I don't want to pick on anybody in particular, but when you say we have a COMPA rate of 0.97, can you explain how you came upon that? In the minimal comparisons I did last fall, I would say we're more like 1.50 as opposed to 0.97 when comparing to the state of Minnesota and Goodhue County.
Okay. Chair Anderson, Regents, Fiscal, members of the committee. You may not know it, but I also run a farm in Ohio, so I'm pretty familiar with the seed corn problem you're describing, and I would like to solve that for you here this morning. The fact of the matter is, good compensation principles require that you look at a broad range of employers to set your market, not just a single employer that you compare to. And so good practice would suggest that we look to where we get employees from and where they go to. Those are individuals who are primarily coming to us from the private sector in most all of our job classifications. I don't want to say we never get people from a county or we never get people from the state, because of course certainly we do. But that is not the majority of our employees. The majority of our employees are coming to us from private sector sources. So we will consider counties, we will consider states, the state, and we will consider private sector. So we look at that as a whole. And it really would be, I think, a disservice to look at only a state comparison or only a county comparison. And the reason for that is those jobs don't perfectly align with the jobs that we have. We have different kinds of jobs than a county or a state. We do use comparisons for local markets. For example, in setting our police salaries, we look to local jurisdictions that are comparably sized to see what their police are paying. So we do use those in appropriate situations, but we have a lot of job categories that are not found in a county and are not found in the state. They're not a perfect match, nor would we expect them to be, and that's okay. But what we do try to do is look at a very broad, cross-functional set of employers, and we look to where we're getting our employees from and where they're going. As to more of the specifics on the administrative job family, I'll let Ken respond to that.
If I could interrupt just for Vice President Brown, I think you're right in regards to that response in many job families. I think you're wrong in quite a few job families. And my guess, my perception, and perception becomes reality, right? My perception is that tech jobs at the state of Minnesota or Hennepin County are pretty similar to tech jobs here, IT jobs. HR jobs, your area, pretty similar to the state of Minnesota as to the University of Minnesota. That's my guess. Am I wrong in that? Then there are many classifications that are not comparable that you can't find comparability, I'm sure.
Chair Anderson, Regent Swigum, members of the committee, In the HR family, I would say there probably are similarities, and we certainly do look at counties, we look at the state, but we also, most of the people that are coming into my office, Ken being one of them, came from the private sector. So we have to look more broadly, or else we aren't going to fully capture the market. In the tech world, our tech is unique in the sense that we do a lot of things in the educational world that other agencies are not doing, and some of our technology people have specialized expertise in that area. So I'm not a tech expert, I can't say for sure, but I think the principle, the compensation principle, still should be applied, that we look at a broad set of comparisons and not get too myopic and look at a single comparison. And Ken, do you want to speak to the administrative job?
Yeah, Chair Anderson, Regents Figum, and I can respect your perspective, Regent. When we look at benchmarking our markets, we painstakingly review virtually every peer survey that's available for different types of job categories. And our compensation team, which has somewhere north of probably 60 years of compensation experience professionally in the local Minnesota market and nationally, has good expertise to determine what are the appropriate surveys that we should purchase and how frequently we should and when we should age data. We house that all in our own platform. We do not pay an outside consultant to do that, and that's a high value. And the reason we do that is I think it's good basic compensation strategy, and it also comes under the direction of the Regent policy, which does direct us to look at institutional peers and appropriate labor markets. We do look at the state, and I do have colleagues over there that I talk to frequently and value and trust their judgment. I mean, we do partner in a lot of things locally. And I also know that some things are similar in our jobs and some things can be very different. So that's my perspective, but I certainly respect your opinion.
Thank you. Regent Powell, did you have a point to this specific question, or was it more general?
Chair Anderson, it's just really to underscore the conversation that's just taking place.
If you will.
Which is that I know that we, as a board, have to be careful about where we go deep and where we don't go deep, and this is a very complex area that's being, managed with a lot of expertise. But I would just like to add that I think we'll go around in circles on some of these conversations until the board gets into the peer data, which I actually think is an appropriate area for the board to focus on and to really look at these comparators, and that would be very standard practice at other large organizations, because so much builds on that. And if you have questions about the peer set, as I think some regions do, we're just not going to be able to move the ball here until we are all satisfied that we have the right peer set.
Thank you. That's a terrific point, and I just want to point out this is a great subject. It's of interest to all of us. We've kind of went through the time allotment we had. However, because of its importance, I want to continue on. I just want you to know that this is the first agenda item of 11. And so there are people that want to still speak. I would ask you to try to be brief and get to the questions and to the points so we can move on if that's the case. With that said, Regent Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And with apologies, Vice President Brown, because I did not talk to you earlier about a concern. As I've listened to the very good discussion this morning, your presentation, I do believe there's an issue that has not been talked about. And that is, and I agree with the discussion about pay and compensation, but the issue is number of employees. Number of employees. In today's world, that is a big deal. Let me give you a couple of examples. From my days in the military, for every person who was on the battlefield, there was 10 people bringing groceries, bullets, and supplies, and those kinds of things. That number continues to decrease. I don't know what the number is today. I'm familiar with another organization. It's a private sector organization. It's $500 million. They have 84 full-time employees. Now, if we do the math here at the University of Minnesota, I'll say 18 to 20,000 full-time employees, and there's 65,000 students, give or take. That equates to about 3.5 employee for 3.5 students. I think going forward, and I know I'm getting now into management, if you will, which we ought not do, but it reflects the way we do budget. I think that there's always the propensity to add work. And I get to this point, what is important for today, for the good of the organization, for the good of the university, and what can be left to another day? Every person in this room probably is gritting their teeth and saying, Dean Johnson, why are you bringing this up? You don't know how hard we work. We have much work to do. I get all that. But in a day of competition in higher ed and budget and constrained budget, I think that the number of employees, the way we manage those employees and work expectations and workload needs to be part of the discussion. Every person in this room, from the president right on down, to say, Dean, you don't realize how hard we work. We had this discussion in our briefing with Mr. Burnett. It's not about how hard you work, it's about the workload and what needs to be done in higher education. There are some things that just are going to have to be left for another time and another place. So I would appreciate in the discussion going forward just the number of employees that are doing work throughout the whole university system. I'm not calling for layoffs, I'm not calling for any of that, but going forward, I think to do better planning in the workforce. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Do you want to respond to that, Vice President Brown, or should we take point taken and move on?
I'll make just a quick response, if you don't mind. Chair Anderson, Regent Johnson, members of the committee. Our presentation today focused on the dollar sign and are we spending those dollars effectively. The question you're asking really goes to the left side of that chart, is what are the University of Minnesota mission and priorities, and how many people do we need to accomplish that? So that was not really addressed. I will say, just parenthetically, that in the Office of Human Resources, we work with units quite regularly to look at their organizational structure. How can they organize themselves to get the work they have done in a most effective and efficient way. And I think you will find that most of them, as part of the cost reductions that have been occurring over the last year, have actually been reducing the number of staff and are having to reorganize work and so forth. So that is in process, and I think a final point is that our total spend on the budget for total compensation has been very steady over the last many years. So I guess I would say that is a good thing we should always look at and examine, but I don't feel that we are in a panic that it's rampantly out of control, that it's escalating in a inappropriate way. The numbers simply don't show that in terms of the percent of spend on total compensation.
Thank you. Student Representative Keon.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. Also, for the presenters, thank you so much for taking this presentation. I really appreciated having all of the information about. So I have two questions on behalf of the student body. The first one is whether or not all of the positions listed were full-time. And the second was if you had two specific examples of positions in the first two tiers of the student service job band.
Chair Anderson, Student Representative Keon, members of the committee, the data that we were working from was all FTEs at the university, so that would be full and part-time for a total FTE structure. As to the student support services, I'll let Ken respond to that.
Chair Anderson, Student Representative Keon, thank you for the question. In the Student Services job family, if you look at the first two levels, admission associates, student finance counselor 1, student service professionals, those are some of the job titles you would see in the ranges to the left on that slide.
I would think most of those people would be in direct supporting student organizations, frontline workers in the student unions, variety of positions of that type.
And your question about full-time, we look at full-time equivalents a lot of the time, so there are percentage appointments that may not be full-time, they may be three-quarters time. It's depending on the need and the strategy of the department.
Thank you. You know, like I said, there's a lot of interest in this subject, and we're actually starting now our second time around with Regents and their questions. So these questions and answers I'm going to ask to be very brief. Regent Hsu.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. I will be very brief. I would like to echo what Regent Johnson discussed. I know this isn't the day to have that discussion, but we've talked about talking about it in the future, and I don't think we ever talked about it. So my last question is regarding, there's a lot of, has been a lot of discussion, as we all know, about living wage. I'm not sure how it got defined. It's $15 an hour. I know there are some governments laws or policies about having a living wage. I don't know what our policy is. I don't think we have one, but I'd like to hear kind of what our thinking is on that, and how many people do we have under $15 an hour right now, if you know.
Sir.
Chair Anderson, Regent Hsu, that's an excellent question. We did an analysis last year when this was a frequent topic in the news, and very few, a small number of our employees were actually under $15 an hour. Most of those were, I think, under the Teamster contract, and that is addressed within their contract, but outside of that, and that might have been a little north of 100 employees, everyone else was above that minimum.
And we can speak to the Teamster contract issue when we present that contract for you.
That'll be about 4:15 this afternoon. Regent Omari.
I'll be the briefest. I just want to draw attention to the Duluth ranking of faculty salaries compa ratio of 0.87, so we should be paying very close attention to that.
Regent Beeson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll remind Regent Johnson, last summer at our budget discussion, we talked about efficiency of workforce, and I'll ask staff to circulate the graph. I think we showed in that about a 30% increase in productivity in terms of number of employees against assets and revenue. This might be a progress card goal going forward, because it is a true measure, and I think whether we agree or disagree that we've gone as far as we can on that, it's really quantifiable, and the data that I saw goes back 15 years and does tell some story. We would expect it to be more efficient, as every organization's had to be.
Thank you. You know, I want to thank the two of you for being here. This, as you can tell, this is of great interest to myself and my colleagues, and not only us, but I think the people of the state of Minnesota we represent want to see that tax dollars that are given in appropriations, we get the best bang for the buck that we can. I would suggest to Senior Vice President Burnett here, who works with the agenda with me, that we find more time for this topic. I think it's fabulous, and I think my colleagues would agree. With that, I'm going to thank you two, and we're going to move on to our next agenda item.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're welcome. The second agenda item we're going to ask or have today is going to be starting to frame up the 2019 budget. And I hope Associate Vice President Tonneson is in. There she is. Well, that's good for you. When you get ready, we're ready for you.
Okay.
Do you want to? Sure. Okay. Senior Vice President Burnett's going to give us a little opening.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And as Julie and Associate Vice President Tonneson sitting down, I'll just tee this up. This is the latest iteration of the budget for fiscal year 19. We've talked about this through the fall, and this is honing in on what we see are the parameters and getting feedback from the board as we bring a budget proposal to you at your next formal meeting in this room in May. And then you would be asked to vote on a fiscal year 19 budget in June. So what Associate Vice President Tonneson's bringing today is more refinement of the work that we've been doing for the fiscal year 19 budget. Through the work you did at the last meeting in December, we refined some assumptions around NRNR tuition for 19, which gives more certainty to the data. And with that, we'll turn it over to Associate Vice President Tonneson for the presentation for the board.
Vice President Tonneson, if you will.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and members. I will keep these comments brief. It's hopefully just a setup for what would be a longer conversation and discussion among board members about the budget for next year. Just to remind you, this is the third year in which we've worked with you over the course of your meeting schedule to prepare for a rich discussion on the President's recommended budget. As Senior Vice President Burnett said, we will bring to you for review in May. In this process, we've generally talked about the way we've traditionally structured conversations around the budget and the timeline in which those conversations and decisions have taken shape. We've explained why most of this discussion centers around O&M and tuition and then reallocation on the resource side and around compensation, as you were just discussing, other operating costs and strategic investments on the spending side. Up to this point, we've shared general information on the dollar value of various changes in tuition or salary increases. And for FY19, we worked with you for an early approval of the non-resident, non-reciprocity tuition rate that you approved in December for students on the Twin Cities campus. Today, as Senior Vice President mentioned, we can now talk more specifically about some of the estimated values for these variables in FY19. This will be the final committee conversation on the budget prior to final development of the President's recommendations. Essentially, as we finalize those recommendations for you, it's sometimes more of an art than a science. But we work really hard to try to ensure that the final product, the budget, is three things: that it is responsible and balanced, that it reflects the priorities of the institution as a whole, and also that it addresses the unique needs of individual units within the university in ways that make them as successful as we possibly can given constrained resources. Along the way in this process, we learn of what is necessary to maintain core operations in the next year. What costs do we need to cover just to keep things moving safely at current levels of activity? And then we discuss what it would take to move to the next desired level of activity, either for the next year alone or as a step along a longer-term path to achieve a strategic goal in the future. When resources are constrained, it's a question of how far beyond core maintenance we can actually go and should go. We believe for FY19, our framework resources are constrained. We've talked about each of these in past meetings, but just briefly to put them before us on the table for today's discussion. The state appropriation is actually dropping by $10 million between the current year and next year. We knew about this as we balanced the FY18 budget, and we chose and made a decision to spend that $10 million on non-recurring items. We did not create a tail. But the fact is that there will be no new resources from the state to cover cost increases for next year, let alone increased program investment. As a reminder, the general fund appropriation from the state, as plotted on this line chart, shows that in FY19, 90% of that appropriation is green or discretionary, and 10% of it represents restricted state specials. For tuition, in setting the tuition rates for our students for the coming year, we purposefully constrain the resources through the decisions we make as an institution. Our goals in this area have recently included minimal or no more than inflationary increases on the resident undergraduate tuition rate on the Twin Cities campus, accelerated increases on the non-resident, non-reciprocity undergraduate rate on the Twin Cities campus, and what you approved for next year in December is consistent with that goal. Flat, if possible, on the system campuses for their resident and non-resident populations, and minimal or no more than inflationary increases in the graduate and professional rates generally. For FY19, as you think about what is best for students in the context of balancing the institution's budget, we've identified the revenue to be gained from implementing according to these goals. Each 1% increase on the resident undergraduate Twin Cities campus rate is estimated to generate $3.4 million. The increase you approved for the non-resident, non-reciprocity rate on the Twin Cities campus is estimated to generate $8.8 million, but that is before we would do additional spending on waivers for that population. And each 1% increase on the graduate and professional rate is also estimated to generate about $3.4 million. In terms of reallocation, we are constrained by what we can successfully and smartly implement in any given year. But there's three kind of phases to this I want to talk about. Prior to FY14, we implemented annual reallocations anywhere from 0.5 to 3%. That's of total state and tuition dollars. The higher amounts falling in years of actual reductions in state appropriations. Then, in the FY14 through FY19 period, we've been focused on finding about $15 million per year on administrative reallocations, plus whatever was necessary to balance the budget. The average reallocation plan during this time period in the budget has been in the 1 to 2% range. For FY19, we need to find roughly $11 million in additional administrative reallocations, which would be about a 0.6% target, if you're comparing. But we will also need to go above that to balance the budget, depending on the level of spending increases that we have to face and must address, combined with any potential investments in program. As we move beyond FY19, we will continue the annual process of internally reprioritizing resources in a responsible way. We will reduce costs and gain efficiencies as we have in the past, but we must do that carefully in the context of our goals to remain competitive on all fronts. On the spending side, to maintain the core, we believe we will face the costs you see here for FY19. These are represented in the framework funds here in terms of amounts. As I explained on prior occasions, even without any increase in salary, our departments will face an increase in the fringe costs of $8.1 million. Then for each 1% salary increase we implement, we will face an additional cost of $11.9 million. We're also estimating, luckily, no additional required funding for facilities. That is a net position for FY19. We are projecting some decreases in utility costs funded within these framework funds on the Twin Cities campus, but that's offset by slight increases on the system campuses, and we're projecting operating savings on the Twin Cities campus again because of closure of a couple of buildings south of Washington Avenue, but that will be offset by moving into pieces of PWB that Fairview previously paid for through rent, through new operating costs on a building opening in the Duluth campus, and even some lease cost increases. So net, we think we can plan for a minimum of 0 on the facility side. Outside of compensation, our big annual cost increase for next year comes in the technology environment, paying for our annual increases in software licensing and maintenance, including those for PeopleSoft and library subscriptions, and for the new learning management system. Those contract requirements will cost us an additional $3.2 million recurring beginning in FY19. And then finally, in the core cost categories, based on fall discussions we had with support units and what we anticipate will come through the academic process, which is just underway next week, it looks like the bare minimum of increased costs related to health and safety issues, compliance with governmental regulations, and balancing needs at the unit level will be roughly at a minimum $5 million. If we decide to move beyond maintaining the core into new spending on strategic program goals, we've typically planned for total spending in this range in the $10 to $20 million. This is discretionary, so it could literally be any amount. But to move forward in a meaningful way on multiple fronts, that's the amount we would ideally implement. Every year, units bring forward their priorities in alignment with existing strategic plans that center around the 3 motivations indicated here on this slide: to enhance or strengthen existing programs through additional faculty and staff, through an infusion of project funding or modernizing equipment or materials. Second, to take advantage of new opportunities within a limited time frame, perhaps to join a project or a partnership with another institution or another organization. And finally, to expand into new and emerging program areas that we have not offered before. The list of these types of investments is literally endless every year that we could make, but they're best implemented when directly correlated to an established strategic plan. So before turning to a discussion among committee members this morning about the budget, we thought it might be useful to put the value of these different budget components on one page. The resource changes I have mentioned briefly this morning are identified on the left side of this slide with their incremental dollar values lined up at different levels of change. The cost components are listed on the right, again in large categories. In all cases, you can build estimates of different levels of change from what you see here. If you wanted to increase salaries by some percent not on the chart, you can just do the straight multiplication to arrive at a reasonable cost estimate. So for example, a 5% increase on salaries would cost the $11.9 million identified here at 1% times 5, which would be $59.5 million, and so forth. In the bottom right in the cost area, the levels here for those types of investments are identified as our best estimates of what the incremental cost will be at a minimum versus what it would take to implement some reasonable level of investment, or finally to do something more meaningful and yet still be able to implement within a year, and those would be listed in the advanced column there on the right. With that, we are happy to participate or listen as the committee discusses these different variables. Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And if you go back to that last slide, the result you'd like us to have is add up the left side to equal the right side, correct?
Mr. Chair and members, that's the easy part.
That's
the goal. Yes, that's simple.
Just fill in the blocks.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you, Vice President Tonneson. Where are we going to start the discussion today, folks? Who wants to? Regent Cohen.
Thank you, Chair Anderson, and thank you for the report and the numbers, et cetera. And this is going to be very specific, and I, as they say, I don't want to beat a dead horse because I know the decision has already been made. But as we're adding up the numbers on the left side and the right side and trying to have them balance, I'm wondering what that 8.8 million, which is the agreed upon 15% increase, we haven't taken out the waivers nor the extra money we were going to spend on recruitment. So I'm wondering what that 8.8 number really is.
The net increase. Ms. Tonneson, do you have an answer to that, Senior Vice President?
Sure. Chair Anderson, Regent Cohen, and members, there are choices to be made, but if you wanted to, we have to decide on a waiver total. We have talked about $1 million of that 8.8 perhaps being used for additional waivers. So to build that in, that has to come out on the right side. Additionally, in additional recruiters, we have, in the fall process, received a request from undergraduate education for at least 2 additional national recruiters, which would cost us $210,000. That we would actually put in the right column in that minimum column over there in the $5 million as one of the minimum investments. If we wanted to add additional recruiters, then you're moving towards the right. We can still choose to do that, but that would cost additional dollars.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Regent Strickland.
Mr. Chairman, as we develop this framework for May-June activity or May action, and thank you for that last chart. It's a little bit different than I was anticipating. In the big picture, Vice President Townsend, I was thinking, there's so much we can do to develop and to enhance our goal and our mission. I understand that. We're not working on the fringes, working right down the middle. I had the number about 44 million in my mind that we needed when we were considering 2% increases across the board, fringe salary, and here I see 23.8. I was thinking 44 million, and as we look forward to May, June, and providing maybe an opportunity to have a 0% tuition increase, that would be my goal, and I think a goal of some other regents that I've spoken to. I was thinking we needed to get to this 44. We use NR, which we've already decided and voted on to some degree. Maybe some addressing of workforce through attrition, which Regent Johnson has briefed well 10 minutes ago. Maybe getting a little additional help from the state if the February forecast is positive. It is not now, but I think it will be in February. We'll have a positive forecast. maybe using a little Operation Excellence money, not just reallocating, but actually saving. You know, Operation Excellence at 90 million is what I'm referring to. I know most of it's been reallocated in the past to other priorities, which is an ongoing thing we should do, but maybe we could save some of those monies towards tuition. I was trying to, in the framework, balance those things. Am I far off or not? Working on the back of an envelope, is that close enough?
Vice President Tonneson.
Chair Anderson, Regent Fiscal, those are definitely the components that we have to put together. I'm not sure and don't remember where the 44 million comes from. We have consistently...
Somehow in my mind, Julie, I got 22 million, a percent increase was 22 million. I saw that someplace.
May I, if you add the right side, the fringe, you're maybe thinking about 2% salary increase, you're up to 31, 32. The minimum technology is 3, that's 35. Maintain, strength, and core is 5, that's 40 million right there. So that you're on base with that.
Close. Close enough for government workers.
Yep. Vice President Burnett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Regents Fiscal. I think what also Associate Vice President Tonneson is trying to explain is the internal reallocation is a revenue source that would be used to cover that gap.
Right.
Meaning, yes, the operational excellence, we take costs out of the institution. Those take the place of new revenue to fund the investments on the right side. Right. So we're speaking the same thing. We're absolutely not going to close this budget without a reallocation that goes to help pay for if we recommend a compensation increase for our workforce. So it is a combination of what we've made decisions on now, what we'll be bringing to you in May, and certainly there's something that could change as we get with the state, and we want to wait until the February forecast, but there's a chance that the state could be a piece of that. But I don't see us closing this gap. None of us on the leadership of the university see us closing this gap without some level of cutting the university to help fund things on the right side.
Correct.
Mr. Chairman, to my colleagues here on the board and to the administration, I just want to be very open, very transparent as we develop a framework and not surprise anybody.
Yep. Thank you. Vice President Burnett.
And Regents Fiscal and members of the committee, I think that's why we continue to do these iterative discussions meeting by meeting to tell you that we're honing it down, we're bringing it to you, and we're getting close to bringing you recommendations at the next formal meeting of this committee, which will be in May. But you're seeing the elements as we see them now, and honestly very similar to our capital request that went to the state, which was the theme of take care of what we have. Really, this is an operating budget in 19, absent some big change that we're not foreseeing, is really taking care of what we have. It's not going to be full of big new things that are going to be able to be funded within these constraints. So I just want to be very clear that I think our operating budget for FY19 is going to look very similar to the capital request that we brought back and that you all approved to send forward to the state.
You have another comment, Regent Fiscal, or should I move on?
No, move on.
Regent Powell.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. And first of all, I just want to thank you for the regularity of these updates. I think it's really helpful. And also, it is such a complicated area, and you've boiled it down to the 4 or 5 levers I think that the Regents should and can focus on. And I think it's really helpful to the conversation. So thank you. The priority for me as we go into next year on the expense side is I want to be competitive on salary and fringe. And so I'm speaking for myself, but I think, for all the reasons we heard earlier, I think we need to maintain that pool. And I think a comment was made in the earlier presentation about institutions that start to go there and you just delay the day of reckoning, and then the following year you have a 4% issue instead of a 2% issue. So the priority for me is we got to maintain that. I would like the administration to come forward to us and say, this is what we think that means. This is what we think being competitive will mean next year, rather than us guessing because it's not our area of expertise, and then lay out a plan to solve for that, protecting that compensation increase, which I think we'll need, which is going to be a combination of, we've already talked about it, NR. I think I can live with some tuition increases. Others, I think, maybe cannot. I can live with 1%. And then I think we need to look at productivity and, the other areas that were discussed. But I think you need to tell us, here's what we need to do to stay competitive. Here's a plan to solve that. And then I think we can look at additional investments beyond that. But I wouldn't start looking at those until we've solved the, the core issue.
Thank you, Regent Paul. I'll move on to Regent Lucas.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. I'm looking at the incremental resources and wondering how squishy those numbers are. For sure, the NR should be about 7.5 based on what you said about waivers and recruiting, and we don't know if we have to do additional recruiting, but I don't like to see us carry a number of 8.8 if it's actually 7.5. And the other is the internal reallocation. It's a really big number, and I'm just wondering how squishy that is.
Vice President Tonneson.
Chair Anderson, Regent Lucas, members, on the tuition side, just on the 8.8 million, I want to be clear, that is a gross number, and we have netted it out on the right in terms of what we must do in the expense area. So in those minimum investments over on the right, we would include the netting out of those aid and recruiting expenses. You can't see it, but it's in there. But in terms of how squishy they are, on the revenue side, typically our revenue estimates on tuition are based on current enrollment. And how the process works is we now meet with each one of our colleges and campuses and talk with them about what they are seeing in terms of enrollment for next year to understand if we need to adjust these revenue estimates, and we will do that as we move through the process. But and oftentimes they will drop a little bit from what you see here, but not always. So they're reasonably, I think, confident. We're reasonably confident in those numbers. In terms of reallocation, generally speaking, based on history, what we bring to you in the budget will be more than what you see here for reallocation. Again, that's a process where we give targets to units that are based on some of these percents, and then we work with them to understand what they need to reallocate to meet all of their core costs. And there are some units that will be reallocating more than others. And so quite often, what we bring to you in the end will actually be more than this, but this is depending on the percent that we go with, it'll be more. So if we chose a 0.75% at $13.5 million as our target, we will come in somewhere closer to 20, for example. That's just based on past experience. So I think for planning purposes, at this point in the process, as you're trying to think about balancing, these are appropriate numbers to use, but they will not be the exact numbers we bring to you in the end, because we will refine them as we work with the units.
Thank you. Great answer.
Answers the question.
Follow-up?
Yeah, please. I know that we give these targets to units, and early on, I'm sure it was easier to find this money than it is now, and I'm just wondering how close to the bone are we on asking units to cut, because in the end what we really need to be is excellent.
Vice President Tonneson.
Mr. Chair, members, I really wish that I could give you a definite answer to that question. We do know that it is getting more difficult for units to find what I would call smart reallocations, where there just isn't the fat, if you will, as there was in the beginning, but they are making some tough decisions about, and a lot of it does have to do with workforce, quite frankly, not filling positions that if they had their preference, we would fill. And we would try to do more, but it is very tight in many places. And there are some units that, by the way, that even though we give a planning target to, that in the end we choose a lower level of reallocation based on the impact that it will have on them. So it isn't across the board in terms of how we apply it.
Thank you. President Keeler wants to weigh in on this.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. I just would take this opportunity to amplify Ms. Tonelson's comments and just reflect on the fact, as you have heard recently, this board is leaning very hard on my administration to reduce expenditures and cut costs. We are going to do that. When we do that, that will impact people and it will impact programs. All of those people and all of those programs have constituencies and perceive high value in what they receive from the university. If you're going to continue to insist, as I believe you should, on a reduction of expenditures, when we execute on those expenditure reductions, I ask for your continued support and endorsement of what we're doing. We're doing what you are asking us to do. It's painful and it's going to impact people. Thank you.
Thank you. Good. Regent Lucas, you're finished?
It's fine, thank you.
Regent Beeson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, President Keeler, for those comments. Going back to the recruitment side for just a moment, I had suggested last December that it's probably fallen on deaf ears, but my point was, still is, and will continue to be, to develop an even more aggressive recruitment and sales force, and that includes, if we were a business, we would have a call center institution, and when we look at their system campuses, this is frightening where their numbers are and could be. So I know we're adding more resources. You mentioned a couple of people. I don't think that's enough. I don't think it has a campaign feel that we really need at this point, so I just urge going forward even more focus around that. Second comment is the most striking part of this budget continues to be, and I am going to call this out every time we have a discussion about the budget, is the defunding from the state of Minnesota. We're getting less money than we were 15 years ago. And it's our responsibility, even though we're elected from the legislature, to make that part of the conversation. There's no excusing around that fact. Our spend rate is less than it is at the state than other units of government, including the state. We're more efficient, we're more productive, but yet we fail to mention we're getting defunded. So 20% of our budget gets defunded or frozen, and we're expected to make up from the other sources and keep tuition at zero or at inflation rate. I just really think that we need our share of their money. It's the fungible money. Thank you.
Thank you, Regent Beeson. Regent Omari.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. I agree with President Keeler's comments, and I think that we as a board need to keep in mind that this is what we ask, and that I will also turn that back and say that the communication and public relations strategy from the administration should be top-notch if we are going to be defunding or closing certain areas of the institution that do have stakeholders. So it's a team effort. I want to make one note of a lever that I think we often kind of skip over, which we have more graduate and professional students than I think any other institution in the country, and yet we tend to see things about graduate and professional tuition rates, but we don't really lock in and get into those numbers as much. My understanding is that traditionally it's been a recommendation from some colleges to the administration of how much they want to increase tuition, and some have even planned for it strategically to keep it lower, so on and so forth. So it varies depending on program and graduate offering departments and colleges. But I would actually love for us as a board, as we move forward, to dig into graduate and professional tuition and fees as we have undergraduate, because we have a large number of graduate and professional students across the system.
Thank you. I don't think there's anything that needs to be asked. That's more of a comment. Regent McMillan, did you have a comment?
Thank you, Chair Anderson. Just trying to listen and soak in a wide range of comments, some of which are focused on how we solve this budget challenge, and some of which are much more forward-looking in scope about how we're going to handle upcoming budgets. I'm actually probably more interested in the latter, and I appreciate the comments that Regent Beeson just made, that President Keeler made, that others have made about how we're going to get where we need to be in 2020, 2021. And I'm struck by the graphic that Vice President Tonneson put up about, looking back a decade ago. And my concern is that we inform our spending decisions and our budgeting process with a system-wide strategic plan, because where we got to it after the state went through the last round of disinvestment, if you will, the 08 downward trend to 012, the university, prior administrations made decisions about the fundamental base of the budget that we have today, which we're still living with. And President Keeler and his team make incremental reallocations around that. We make incremental spending decisions. But I don't know that this board and this administration have ever gone back and actually taken apart the fundamental base funding decisions that underpin that. And whether those are system campuses, whether they're colleges, we had a memo back in November about law, UMD, and another element, and what underpins those too is base funding decisions. And there's nothing that says what was decided in 08 or 09 still is appropriate for today. So I find it hard to evaluate and think about where I want to land in an incremental nature. I have to really see that informed by a system-wide strategic plan. It helps me make decisions about where and when we make funding decisions. So I don't know that that's helpful, but that's where this Regent's landing as I listen to my colleagues talk about future spending and bigger budgeting decisions that take us beyond solving the 18-19 challenge.
President Keeler, did you have a response to that?
Thank you, Chair Anderson, and that Regent McMillan is, of course, exactly right, which is why we're in the middle of the strategic planning activity. And ironically, we spent yesterday afternoon in a retreat around strategic planning and level setting, and we're right on pace where we need to be to deliver on the timeline that we agreed with the board in September. But an outcome of that conversation was really a reflection on the near impossibility of delivering the long-desired long-range financial plan that this board is after. And a reason for that actually is illustrated in the slide that Regent McMillan is referring to around state support. That's an important part of what we do, and it is, within a horizon more than a couple of years, essentially unpredictable. And so, absent that predictability, it's difficult for us to nail the long-range strategic plan and the vision that Regent Emeritus Allen had, for example. And that's probably fine. We can live with that. But to Regent McMillan's point of a plan and this board sitting down and looking very, very carefully at these base allocations and the strategy that those reflect is exactly right, and we're eager to do that. We'll work with you through the spring and the presentations that are scheduled, and Vice President Burnett will wrap that up in time for our budget presentations for the biennial budget allocation in the fall. So we're all in sync on this and on schedule, and we will deliver.
Thank you, President Keeler. Regent Cohen.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. I just want to add a couple things in agreement with some of my colleagues. I certainly agree with what Regent Powell said in terms of competitive compensation and how important that is. And Regent Lucas took the words right out of my mouth when she talked about the excellence of the university. And I want that to be part of our conversation, because whatever we do, I think we want to guard the excellence of the university. And so, Mr. President, don't cut too many things. That I also can live with an undergraduate increase in tuition.
Student Representative Anderson.
Thank you, Chair Anderson, members of the board. As a student representative, part of my job that I've taken upon myself is to educate my campus. And so last night at a student association meeting, we engaged in a robust conversation, believe it or not, about the budget conversation we're talking about now. And two things that I want to share with you, two comments from opposite sides of the spectrum when we talk about the burden coming to student tuition. We've talked about excellence and we've talked about cuts, and students don't feel like those two things could possibly go together. But two student comments that I specifically want to share. One student said, when we've gotten to a place where the burden needs to come on the students, I believe that we need to go back to the drawing board. The institution must be more creative than that, where there's somewhere else they could go besides the students. That was one comment. On the other side of the spectrum, I'm at the University of Minnesota for excellence. If it's going to improve, I'm willing to pay for it. So we have varying student bodies, and I just want us to be cognizant that there are people on really opposite sides of the spectrum, and I hope that we're cognizant of that moving forward.
Thank you. You know, those are really insightful comments, and your first one especially. I think back when I went to this institution, out of the 100% of the educational costs, 70% was borne by the state of Minnesota taxpayer, and 30% was my tuition. For whatever reason, you can blame it where you want. That has been totally flipped. The 30% has been borne by the taxpayer, 70% on the student. And I think it behooves us as an organization. I think Regent Beeson was eloquent in his address about it, that, you know, we need more state support. We need our people to understand that the University of Minnesota and the Minsky schools are what will drive this state going forward. Let's put an investment there. So I appreciate the insightfulness of the students in hearing that. Regent Hsu.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. I thought maybe you forgot about me.
No.
Well, I think this has been a great discussion. I specifically want to ask a couple questions regarding some of there was a little bit of comments about some of these things, but specifically, so we are dealing with some issues with funding at the law school, for example. We've seen some memorandums on that. How does that play into this? Is that built into maintaining the core already? Or is it somewhere else that is going to come back and hit us after we kind of look at these variables?
Vice President Burnett, I'll let you answer that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Regent Hsu, we continue to work on issues where there are challenges like the law school. We would put the maintaining, strengthening core probably right there in that, and we can certainly detail that when we bring it up. We don't have a solution at this point. We're still working through a number of things monthly with the law school. We have a committee that's spending a great deal of time with them. But it would be in there. It's certainly not anything other than trying to strengthen the core. But there are other academic units as well that are we're devoting extra attention to.
Right. Okay. Thank you. So I agree with Chair McMillan that if we had, and I've been trying to get to this point where we could have a strategic plan that could actually inform us as to where we need extra dollars going forward. Long-range financial planning would go along with that. So just as of today, I'll just give you my feedback on where I think we should go. I'd like to see the compensation at closer to 1% than 2%. I would like to see other costs towards the minimum, which would put us in the $30 million range on the right side. And then I would obviously like to see as much internal reallocation as possible. 18 million would be terrific, more would be better. And then I would just say that I think the undergraduate tuition should be frozen so that we can we talked about catching up to salaries. Well, I think we have to catch back to where we were, because we did raise undergraduate tuition by more than inflation over the last several years. And just one broader comment, so that would get us close to 30 on the left side also. I was thinking about the fact that when I first came here, and this would be 3 years ago, the budget was around $3.6 billion. Now we're talking about probably over $4 billion, or close to $4 billion, which, is more than a 10% increase just in my time here. And I don't think it's sustainable. I've always said that I don't think we can sustain that, and it's pretty clear that we won't be able to sustain it without more state funding. And I agree with Regent Beeson that that we should be advocating for more dollars from the legislature. But I think at the same time that we do that, we have to show them that we are efficient with our dollars. And to Regent Swigham's point about the salary issue, I think, well, obviously he came out of the legislature, so and so did Regent Johnson. I think we do have to think like legislators when we approach them to increase our funding, and the place to start is to make sure that we have a budget that reflects some of the concerns that they have. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Appreciate that. President Keeler.
Thank you. If I might just comment on Regent Shu's good observations. In a little bit, this plays to Regent Johnson's comments earlier, which I didn't comment on then, but I just can't help it. We need to be careful when we talk about our budget, because there are a lot of components in our budget. We have more research than we did. That's a good thing. Our budget goes up. We get a MnDrive initiative from the state of Minnesota. Our budget goes up. We need to be very careful about the component of our budget that comes from undergraduate tuition, and I'm really proud of the fact that we've bent the curve on that in the past 6 years. So lots of moving parts and lots of ways to measure productivity. I think an industry average, which is employee per net asset dollar, is a reasonably good thing. Employee per student in an organization that has an important research component, an important healthcare component, an important outreach component is not a valid measure of our productivity. I'll quit there.
Thank you. Vice President Tonneson, unless you have something else to say, thank you for your update. And you almost got us back on schedule, so thank you. While we wait, we're going to have our next item is a campus community relations update. Chief Government Relations Officer J.D. Burton and I think Mr. Garcia Luna are here from Community and Local Government. They're coming. Regent Shu, I can't help but say, when you said we have Regent Sviggum and Regent Johnson from the legislature, I don't know if that's a blessing or a curse.
I was just making an observation.
Okay, we're going to get these guys teed up, and then we're ready to go.
No, he didn't. Yeah, he did. Listen to
So, just that one to go forward, that one to go back, back. Okay. And that's the next slide. That's the slide. That's the next slide.
Thank you. Thank you, Liz. Good morning, everyone. Mr. Chair, members of the committee, member of the board, excuse me.
Go ahead.
Thank you, sir. My name is J.D. Burton. I'm the Chief Government Relations Officer here at the University of Minnesota. I'm joined today by Eric Garcia Luna, who is our Director of Community and Local Government Relations. Today we're going to discuss the vision of our team and how we build on existing partnerships with our neighborhood organizations, while also renewing and expanding our connections with elected officials at all of our campuses across the entire system. This vision is driven by the need to better coordinate and support all university colleges and units in their relationships, not only with state and federal officials, but also with our local elected officials. In turn, we believe this will strengthen our capacity to engage and leverage our expertise in policy development, community connections, and both short and long-term planning. We know that our system campuses cannot be successful without safe neighborhoods, strong community connections, and a vested local interest in ensuring that the university, which in many of our communities is the largest employer, is positioned to succeed. With that in mind, last October we hired Mr. Garcia Luna to help us lead our efforts in local government and community relations. Eric comes with an extensive background as an alum, both at Minneapolis City Hall, but also extensive connections in local community relations and local governments. He is tasked with building on the strong work of his predecessors in this position, while also continuing to move forward with our engagement with local communities. With that, I will turn it over to Mr. Garcia Luna to provide the remainder of the presentation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Garcia Luna.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Anderson, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity of being here today. Expanding on the need to work with a more robust definition of community, this presentation will focus on the following. Our work to increase visibility among local units of government with the purpose of building goodwill and collaborate more closely with the community in the pursuit of specific goals. Taking advantage of the dynamic communication tools we have to expand our reach into the community and among our local partners. Assessing the present and future of the University District Alliance. The ultimate goal of working with all of our system campuses to exchange best practices and expand this concept system-wide. As I get started, I want to recognize the work done by my predecessor, Jan Morlock, to build strong relationships with the neighborhoods around campus. It is on that work that we're able to build upon to broaden the scope of our work. Let me first direct you to the resolution approved by this body in 2014. The full text is included in your docket, but I specifically want to highlight the 2 points on the screen because the work you will hear about here today is centered around those goals. In the resolution, it is recognized that strategies to increase the university's engagement with our local units of government and partners, as well as effectively advance the interests of both the university and the community, are important and necessary. How are we going to effectively work towards fulfilling those strategies? The answer is by leveraging the impact the university has on each community. With more than 67,000 students and over 26,000 employees across the system, our footprint is felt in every aspect of the local economies we operate in. As we carry out our mission, not only are we the source of innovative ideas and high-quality workforce, we're also neighbors, colleagues, friends, and partners with our local communities and local units of government. Positive results require strong partnerships and collaboration, and we are committed to working closely with our many partners for the benefit and growth of everyone in the cities and communities we have a presence in. The university interacts in several ways with our local units of government. For example, the Department of Community Planning and Economic Development at the City of Minneapolis has been working closely with the university library system to map racial disparities. Capital Planning regularly consults with municipal staff when scoping University of Minnesota projects, like in the case of Athletes Village and the Bell Museum. Regent Bison, last year, you made reference to the city's level of engagement in planning, emphasizing that, quote, the university is the default planning agency for transportation and safety, end of quote. Regent Lucas, I know you're very interested in hearing more about programs that expand home ownership. Ultimately, our goal is to proactively work with our local units of government and other partners, build trust, and create goodwill to advance the interests of the University of Minnesota while achieving a vibrant, welcoming, and safe environment in our communities. We want to get to that point in which we can have the level of presence that allows us to conduct those conversations in a very strategic manner. As you know, all politics is local. We understand the priorities of a council member's ward is top. We enjoy a great relationship with Council Member Gordon, and we've started conversations with Council Member Fletcher, who was kind enough to join us at the Minneapolis Chamber lunch last month. We also know how legislative bodies operate, and we believe it is important to engage with all council members, mayors, county commissioners, etc. We are meeting with them, highlighting the value of the university, what it brings to their communities, but also listening to what's important to them and their constituents. Behind our strategy, there's a proactivity and intentionality. That's how we will advance the interests of the university while working with our community partners to maintain a vibrant and prosperous environment. This is our old website on the screen. The scope of the work that the audience is reflected on it. Last year, you heard from my predecessor who talked about the University District Alliance. I will talk about it a little later, but briefly mention it now because traditionally the scope of communication with community partners has been limited, focused on particular issues related to events and occurrences that may affect nearby neighborhoods towards a limited audience. I consider that kind of communication to be critical in maintaining good relationships with our immediate neighbors. We're actually joined today by the chair of Marcy Homes, who's sitting in the audience. And again, you know, I consider that kind of communication to be crucial. But technology today enables us to expand not only our audience, but also the type of information that we distribute. Today, as you have heard through this presentation, we have embraced a broader definition of community and consequently a broader scope of work. While there is much more work to be done, our website today reflects our new direction. When done, we expect the content in it to showcase the value of the university to local officials and community neighborhood organizations, keep faculty, staff, and alumni informed of the work the university does in partnership with community and local government, provide an easy way for visitors to contact community and local government relations, alert community members of timely information that affects them, provide information on important steps taken by local governments. With technology at our fingertips, we are able to interact with more people and optimize and reimagine the use of resources we designate towards community relations. Social media will be critical in engaging our larger and more diverse audience and help develop stronger two-way relationships all around. You heard me talk about the University District Alliance briefly, an entity intended to be a representative body of the joint interests of the University of Minnesota, the City of Minneapolis, the recognized neighborhood associations, and business organizations. The purpose and goals of the University District Alliance are as relevant today as they were 10 years ago. Yet, while conversations on livability continue to take place, it became evident as I met individually with leaders of the member organizations that the value they see in being members of the UDA has diminished over the years. At the time of its creation, this body was envisioned to be independently managed and serve as communicator among its partners, as well as facilitate, initiate, and manage joint projects. Today, the UDA is a forum for discussion, but needs a clear strategic short-term action plan. With changes in leadership and staffing among some of the member organizations, we have a unique opportunity to revisit the makeup and purpose of the University District Alliance. As a first step, the board has agreed to convene a meeting with leaders from each member organization with the purpose of discussing what benefit does each member see as part of their seat in the University District Alliance, and given that each member is unique and brings a different set of interests and concerns to the table, what is the benefit of having a common discussion table? We expect this to be a multi-step process, and we'll provide you with an update on the outcome. I will end this presentation emphasizing that it is our intention to draw best practices from the work we'll carry out and exchange them with our campuses system-wide, with the objective of constructing a common community and local government relations platform. It is important that we move in that direction. We recognize the uniqueness of each campus and learn from some of the great work being done there. In Duluth, for example, Mayor Larson is engaged in and will be hosting her August town hall in the city, opening an opportunity for a closer partnership with the city to engage jointly with the community. We fully intend to capitalize on the strong work underway in Crookston, Duluth, Morris, and Rochester to take lessons learned from the Twin Cities campus and spread it system-wide, as well as learn from efforts already underway. Thank you for the privilege of presenting our vision to you today, and I welcome your thoughts and suggestions.
Thank you very much, and welcome to the team.
Thank you.
Regent Lucas has something to say, okay? I didn't see your hand, I'm sorry.
Got a little hand. Thank you, Chair Anderson. I have particular interest in this because I have worked in my professional life in all four of these neighborhoods that adjoin the university, and I can't emphasize enough how important it is for the university to be involved in these neighborhoods. I think so far a lot has been done with a little, but I think if you look at the budget and the resources that we've committed to the University Alliance and to the interaction with the neighborhoods, I think it's been anemic at best. And I hope that out of your process we come out of it with reasonable requests on how we can be better partners with these neighborhoods. I know that other universities in urban areas have struggled with the same kinds of things that we have struggled with, and I hope that we take time to learn their best practices and put them into motion, because it's very important that we have a strong neighborhood surrounding our campus. Thank you.
You have a comment to that, or you just want to hear the
Mr. Chair, Regent Lucas, I agree with you, and I know you and I have had an opportunity to have a conversation regarding the involvement of the neighborhood associations, particularly as it pertains to the University District Alliance, and what you heard in the last couple of slides is precisely the result of that, the result of having those individual conversations, and hoping to engage those with the decision-making power and bring them to the table in order for us to learn learn more and move more strategically towards advancing some of those goals that you're talking about. Thank you.
Regent Beeson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Garcia-Luna, and welcome to the University of Minnesota. And I'm glad you're here. As with Regent Lucas, my professional career has resulted in driving up and down University Avenue over the last 35 years for work. And so I know enough to be dangerous, I think, about the topic. This is this job that you've stepped into is really grown from being what used to be sort of a reactive, complaint-based, putting out fires sort of job into almost a filling a void with, and we've got Ms. Harris here, and she's in the audience. She's helping with this, but being more of a development and sort of planner role with the city of Minneapolis. This is the second most important government relationship we've got, and it's functioned largely by the market force having at it, and the market is great, but the market doesn't look out after our specific interests, and it really only cares about its own buildings. So I think it is a dynamic job we're stepping into. There's a lot of upside with the city. We need them engaged in transportation, infrastructure, other infrastructure, public safety. I think, and we may need to lead those conversations. They may need to react, but this is the new normal for universities to be into this sort of lead development partner.
Thank you, Regent Beeson. Regent Omari.
Thank you, Chair Anderson, and thanks for the presentation. I lived in Southeast Cornwall in graduate student housing for many years. I worked in Dinkytown for many years as a bartender. Whether it's simply geographically connected or long lost siblings, we're connected to the neighborhood. And so I want to kind of think of a term that I'm going to steal from the Office of Public Engagement, which is about reciprocal engagement, right? And I'm not talking about the presentation that we're going to get tomorrow, because I don't know exactly what that engagement looks like quite yet by definition. But I think of this as a reciprocal relationship where there needs to be reciprocal teaching, because the aura of the University of Minnesota, I think, is one that is not well understood by our surrounding members, from the importance of it to the challenges that we face, as well as the opportunities. And so I think as we approach this, it'll be important to be those that are being students to the surrounding areas, and then those that are also teaching about the unique nature of an institution in a city such as ours. And I'd agree with the fact around the city and what that looks like. I think the most what I've seen most recently, and I'd say maybe in the last 4 years, that from the outside looking in appears to be on a upward trajectory, is actually the relationship between Minneapolis Police Department and the U of M Police Department. And so again, I'm only reading these through timely alerts, which we don't always get correct. However, I think maybe that can be a relationship that we model off of to see how we can be forward-thinking and forecasting in looking at the University District Alliance. Thank you.
Thank you. Any comments on that, Mr. Burton?
Mr. Chair, Representative Omari, you hit the nail on the head. The two most important parts of our job in community and local government relations, and government relations in general, is listening and listening. And the more we are able to engage with our community leaders, the more we're able to engage with our elected officials across all the system campuses, better understand what their vision is as they see the university and how that relates to the vision of you and your colleagues, the more successful we're going to be able to be. And so when Eric came on board, his top priority has been to reinvest and re-engage with all of those elected officials and community leaders and ask them, where are we today and where do you think we should be tomorrow? And I think in the short time that Eric's been here, we've seen quite an evolution in the conversations, particularly at the elected level, which had been a little bit absent to a degree. And that is continuing to grow. So we're really excited about the possibility, and we hope that this work will lead us to the next major step, is what is the larger long-term vision that we see for our communities.
Follow up?
Very quickly, please. I forgot to mention that the last slide around the system-wide potential, I'm excited to see what that looks like. And I don't know exactly what it looks like, but I'm excited that we're taking this and making sure that we're thinking about it from a system approach.
Regent Powell.
Thank you, Chair Anderson, and thanks, gentlemen, for the presentation. This is all new to me, so I want to ask a question that's more basic, and that is, so when you're sitting in a room with a neighborhood association and building that relationship, what tends to be the priority issues and concerns that we see, really every day across the communities that we engage in? Is it, as Regent Beeson said, primarily around safety and policing, transportation, these sorts of things? Give me a feel for really where the priority issues of engagement are for us with these various communities and neighborhoods.
Sure. Yeah, Mr. Chair and Regent Powell, thank you for the question. I think you just named them. Housing is definitely among the top priorities. Affordable housing. And for some of the neighborhoods around the university, also parking on the streets, and safety. It's always an issue not only around the neighborhoods here, but everywhere in the city. So those will be, to me, some of the top priorities that I have constantly heard about.
Those are the issues you hear universally?
Constantly.
Thank you. I think with no more questions, we're done with you, gentlemen. You did a great job. And while we prepare, I think our next item on the agenda is Associate Vice President Mason and Senior Director Parks are going to come up and talk to us about an amendment to the Endowment Fund. I guess when we're getting set up, are you going to set this up, Senior Vice President Burnett?
Yes.
We'll let you go ahead and speak while they're getting set up.
So, Mr. Chairman, thank you. As I introduced Associate Vice President Stuart Mason and Senior Director Andrew Parks, this part of your meeting begins on the docket page 172. And for review today is discussion about some adjustments to the endowment fund that our Chief Investment Officer, Stuart Mason, is going to bring forward. With that, Associate Vice President Mason.
Thank you, Senior Vice President Burnett, Chair Anderson Committee. So we have for review the endowment fund policy, which really is an overview or directs us at a high level in all of the investment processes that we do in the endowment. You see on pages 174 to 176 in your docket materials the policy, which is redlined. I want to draw your attention to a couple of issues. First off, in section 4, we have inserted the asset allocation framework, which you all approved in the October board meeting last year. Previously, it had been an addendum to the policy, and at the suggestion of the board office, we have pulled it into the body of the policy. So that section has been approved, and there's nothing new there. Secondly, a little bit more of a minor change in the end of the policy, section 6, subdivision 5. There's a directive in the policy that we consider social responsibility issues in all of our investment processes, and that directive has been there for several years. We have chosen to take this opportunity to expand that directive to be more in line with industry standards and include both environmental, social, and governance related issues. So ESG is currently something that we engage in with our managers as part of our due diligence and underwriting process, and we thought we'd bring the policy sort of up to speed with what the current reality is. The most important changes, however, are in section 6, subdivisions 2 and 4, where we've either refined or we've added new tools that we think are going to help us implement more effectively the new asset allocation framework. And those tools or changes are, we have proposed increasing the private section of the overall endowment from a range that goes up to 40% currently to a target range of 45 to 50%. So a modest increase in the overall private portions of the investment book. Secondly, we've added the use of modest amount of leverage to both increase returns slightly and change the risk profile somewhat. And thirdly, permitting direct co-investments on a limited basis with existing managers in very high profile or high conviction direct investments. And to speak very briefly to those last 3 changes in the investment process, I've asked Senior Director Parks just to add a sentence or 2 on each one of those.
Senior Director Parks, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Regent Anderson. I'll just take each of those substantive topics in order, and to start with liquidity. As we shared with the committee, a key tenet of our asset allocation strategy is to seek excess return in the private markets. And it's been what's driven returns in the past, and we think it'll continue to be the workhorse for the portfolio in the future. That said, the additional opportunity that comes from these strategies also carries with it some additional risk. And so, among a variety of others, these strategies are typically a little bit more expensive. The cost of being drawn is a lot higher, so the gap between a top-performing private equity fund and a bottom-performing private equity fund is a lot wider than what we see in the public equity markets. But most importantly, and what's germane to this discussion today, is that these strategies can limit the flexibility that we have in the portfolio. So they typically are 10-year partnerships. And the capital that's committed to these strategies gets called over a couple of years, gets deployed to the underlying portfolio companies over a couple of years, and then gets harvested after that. And so what we have to be very cognizant of is our ability to have programmatic flexibility, so to be able to rebalance to meet our cash flow needs. And so what we spent a lot of time doing was modeling to look at how the portfolio would perform in different market environments. And really what we think this proposed guideline does is it strikes the right balance of harvesting that illiquidity premium that we get in the private markets while not putting any sort of undue programmatic strain on the portfolio, even if we were to enter a pretty challenging market environment. So as Stuart alluded to, we're recommending shifting that cap from what had been 40% up to roughly 50%. On the leverage front, this one is a bit hard to describe without getting into some technicalities, but at a high level, what we're proposing is making permissible the utilization of a small amount of economic leverage, which is importantly quite distinct from explicit leverage. You can think of explicit leverage as being us going to a bank or a counterparty and borrowing money. That is not what we're proposing at all. Economic leverage just relates to the portion of a derivative position that is not fully collateralized by cash. We have a slide to walk through an illustrative example of this if any of the members of the board are keen to get into the weeds on it. But I would say, in the interest of time, the 4 key takeaways that we would mention as to why we want to support this. One, it enhances our flexibility in terms of how we manage liquidity. It gives us the ability to be more efficient with how we deploy the capital. And lastly, it generates marginally high returns. We're thinking something in the order of 30 or 40 basis points a year. Second thing to keep in mind is it is not inherently a risk-enhancing strategy. In fact, many of the situations in which we would utilize this would involve risk reduction through, for example, buying additional treasury exposure. Third, sizing it at 10% we think is very conservative and very modest compared to what a lot of our peers do. And lastly, this is quite common, as Regent Powell might even be familiar with, given his work at General Mills and their pension fund. Pensions do this all the time to extend the duration of their fixed income portfolio to better hedge their liabilities. So this is not, again, a situation where we'd be out on an island. It's worth noting that the current policy tangentially addresses this issue by suggesting that when we rebalance, we do so on a net unlevered basis. This strategy doesn't really address the issue of rebalancing, so you'll see that portion of the policy was left untouched. So that's why this provision is included as a standalone section. And then lastly, on co-investments, just to define it first, because it's somewhat of a generic term, co-investments relate to minority investments that are made into a business that is typically backed by a private equity company, whereby the private equity fund will syndicate a portion of that deal to some of their limited partners like us. So just to use a simplified example, if a private equity fund had $100 million of capital and their strategy was to deploy it into 10 companies at $10 million apiece, let's say they came across a really interesting opportunity that required $15 million of capital. What they might say is, we don't want to bump up on concentration limits, we don't want to have too much in any given deal, we'll put $10 million of that deal into a fund, and we'll call up 5 of our limited partners and say, do each of you want to put in $1 million apiece into this transaction? It's very beneficial to the private equity fund because it gives them additional flexibility, and it can be very beneficial to us as limited partners because it allows us to better manage our cash flow, to increase exposure to managers we have high conviction in, and importantly, it really reduces cost. So we think the way we're proposing starting with the co-investment program is to have a cap of no more than 3% of the total endowment fund at cost. So again, somewhat of a toe in the water approach, but we think it'll be a good tool to have in the toolkit as we move forward.
Thank you. I have one question real briefly. We have a investment endowment advisory group. Have they been apprised of these, and do they understand it? And I assume they understand it. They're experts. Are they in favor of this type of
Yes,
thing?
Chair Anderson, my apologies. I should have mentioned that at the outset of our presentation. This has been fully reviewed by the Investment Advisory Committee over the course of the last year in conjunction with developing the asset allocation framework, which we discussed last fall.
Terrific. Student Representative Keon has a question.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. If I could draw your attention to subdivision 5. Students were wondering whether or not there was a scorecard or database system to evaluate all those factors when you guys are making a decision on investments.
As I mentioned in my very brief presentation, Representative Keon, the evaluation or the integration of consideration for environmental, social, and governance responsibility has become pretty much an industry standard in terms of underwriting investments that we would make. It has been shown over the course of decades now, but particularly over the last number of years, that companies that exercise good governance, meaning strong board of directors, certain policies around various activities and so forth, oversight and whatnot, show responsibility to social issues that might be either in the community or in the country in which they work, and certainly respect for environmental and so forth, that those companies perform better. They produce better investment returns and on a variety of other metrics as well. And so this is an integral part of every investment that we make, is to evaluate where on a scale a particular investment might fall with regard to each of these.
Vice President Mason, on that point, to advise Student Representative Keon and then a amateur investor like myself, is there a listing of companies, or is there a group, association that says the following public stocks have been seen to pass the environmental, the social, the responsibility? Is there any listing of those companies?
Chair Anderson, Representative Keon, and committee. First of all, the United Nations has published something they call Principles of Responsible Investing, UNPRI. And it lists 6 principles of how one would begin to evaluate some of these characteristics. So it's a global standard that has been developed that enables all of we institutional investors to think about the issues in a similar fashion and evaluate managers appropriately. I would say there's no single listing of companies that are high in the standard or low on the standard. There are a number of associations that apply their own interpretation of these standards and do make a list. I would say many of them usually will have a bias towards low carbon, for example, as one of their criteria for environmental appropriateness, or they might have a social responsibility issue that is key to them. There are lists that eliminate, for example, guns and tobacco and alcohol, for example. So,
not to interrupt you, but this United Nations fundamentals of socially responsible companies may be a point where Student Representative Keon and her friends can look at.
Yeah, that would be good. And we'd be happy to discuss further with you if you care to contact us.
Regent Beeson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, presenters. I do support the recommended policy change. Going to Student Representative Keon's comments, when Lawrence Fink, founder and CEO of BlackRock, gets up and sends letters telling companies that they need to contribute more to society or they'll lose the support of BlackRock's one of our fund managers. This feels like this is a sea change about ready to happen in ways that we've not seen before, and so I think this board would be interested in getting an occasional update on that whole side of the investment scene, or what are you hearing out in the world investment community about his comments?
Vice President.
Regent Beeson, committee, one of the board policies, Board of Regents policies does suggest in the reporting sections that we do report on our activity annually as it relates to certain of these aspects. So expanding this piece would also include expanding that portion of the report somewhat. I think to your second question about what are we hearing, it is ubiquitous, the conversation about how some of these standards, what the appropriate standards should be and how they should be applied. But it is clear, I think, in all of my peers' minds that they're very important criteria to apply when making investment selections or interviewing and diligencing managers.
Thank you. I think this item is for review only today. I think we're probably going to vote on it. I'm not exactly sure. It's either in March or when we're back here in May. Okay.
Mr. Chair, is there any, recognizing that it won't come for a vote until May, is there any challenges in not making some money between that time?
Regent Omari, thank you for the question. No, I think we're good.
All right, thank you.
All right, thank you. We'll let you go. Thank you very much. Oh, excuse me, Regent Johnson. I didn't.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Briefly, I attended my first investment advisory committee meeting yesterday. I just want my colleagues to know that we are well represented by these two gentlemen and the team and the managers that come volunteer their time from the metropolitan area and dealing with huge amounts of money. We kind of skip the first 6 zeros and get on to 7 and 8 zeros in those meetings, but Regent McMillan asked if I would represent the board, and very confident in our team here led by Mr. Mason, so thank you for your work.
Mr. Mason, were the advisory committee members surprised when an offering was asked for at the end of the
meeting? He's good at that.
Thank you.
That's coming next time.
Okay, we've got, I think, our Vice President Mike Burleson's coming up to talk to us about definition of a university community. This again is an item for review. We'll have Mr. Burleson, Vice President Burleson, go through it very briefly with us, answer any questions. Is this also going to then be acted on in May? Okay.
Mr. Chair, members, this will be very brief. On page 177 through 179 of your docket is an update, health and safety, Regents health and safety policy. This is really administrative, kind of a cleanup. This policy guides 11 other administrative policies and 17 procedures for the administration. There's only 2 small changes. We're focusing on environmental and physical resources for safety and deleting monetary, which is covered in many other policies by the board. And then it defines the member of the university community as a student, employer, or someone, a third party who's engaged in activity with the university. And that really is it. The rest stays the same, and I'll take any questions.
All section 2 then, all the changes are in section 2.
That's right.
It's a very brief review. You know, I don't know what the rest of the board feels. We could probably eliminate having Vice President Bertelsen come in May if somebody wanted to take action on this today. Somebody would move to take action. I don't know, maybe we're not ready, but it's just a thought I have. But if we're not ready, we're not ready, and we'll do it in May. Regional Mari?
I would just add, is there any reason not to, that anyone could, before I would make a motion?
Regional Mari has moved. Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Regent Powell has seconded it. We've got a motion and a second on the floor. Is there any further discussion on defining the
member of the community?
The member of the university community. It's all that section 2 there, and it's right on there. It's 3 little bullet points, A, B, and C. Is there any discussion on that? Regent Powell.
Just a quick question. Thank you, Chair Anderson, for Mr. Bertelsen. So does this policy cover any high-risk biological work that we might do? And President Keeler, I don't know that we do any, but to the degree that there is that sort of very high level 4 research, is that covered under this policy, or is that a separate guidance?
Mr. Chair, Regent Powell, I think from the Regent's perspective, this is the umbrella that gives direction. And as I said, there's 11 other administrative policies and procedures that get into all those kind of components. And I have a big list of them, but it includes the kind of things you're talking about.
Thank you.
Any other discussion? We'll take a vote then on the motion to accept the Board of Regents policy on health and safety, the 3 little changes there, subdivision 2, A, B, and C. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passes. Thank you, Mr. Bertelsen.
Next one is review action.
Next is review action. I got to catch up here. Now we're catching up on the agenda. Okay, we are at the point of the agenda where we're going to talk about the Keeler apartment building, which is a review action. We've had this delayed somewhat since December. There's been a lot of talk about it. Regent should be up on it, but I think it's going to be Vice President Bertelsen and Vice President Volna are going to give us a little update on the Keeler apartment building, which we're using as I almost want to say a dormitory right now, under a lease presentation. And I think there's going to be a proposal potentially to purchase that building. Do you want to go ahead and start explaining?
Thank you, Chair Anderson, members of the committee. Yes, the recommendation is to purchase the Keeler apartment building for $12 million. Pages 181 through 183 of your materials provide the background information and a map. Basically, the request, as I said, is to purchase the building. The building is currently owned by Weedham Foundation. There are 2 leases back and forth between Weedham and the University Episcopal Center that provide some of the underlying lease activity that would continue to be applicable after the purchase. The board, you may recall, approved a master lease back in July of 2016 for the apartment buildings for a 5-year period with extensions beyond that would take it out to 2028. The purchase of the purchase of the building essentially has some benefits to the university relative to the current lease arrangement. While the lease arrangement is good, we feel that there are economic benefits beyond the current master lease to purchasing it. It has positive cash flow and net income and is projected over the next 8 years to generate about $830,000 of net positive income. The purchase price of $12 million is significantly below the average of the 2 appraisals that we received on the building. We also think that purchasing the building provides us with control of that location through 2063 versus control just through the end of the lease. And if you can imagine, in 2029, let's say, somebody wants to do something on that building, it is strategic, or on that site, it is strategically located less than a block from campus. We think there's benefit to the university having control of that location. And finally, we think that the purchase actually provides control for pricing around housing of that location, as opposed to the current master lease, which has increases in the latter years. By buying it and providing a stable principal and interest basis for that purchase, it gives us more control over the pricing, and once that mortgage is paid off, it gives us a lot of control over pricing of housing through the end of the building's life. So we will stand for any questions, but we do think that this is the right thing to do.
I guess since it is a review and action item, we can ask questions, I can entertain a motion, and we can get it on the table and discuss it. However the board would like to proceed, I'm willing to do that. If we want to ask questions first and then have somebody go for a motion later, I'm totally fine with that also.
I'll move approval.
Second. Approval, and there's been moved and seconded. So we do now have a motion on the table to purchase the Keeler building. We're going to open it up for questions. Regent Lucas. Forgot who you were.
Thank you, Chair. I totally support this. I think it makes total sense. I'm just curious about the Weedham Foundation and what their motivation was for doing this building in the first place and what their motivation was for University Village. I'm also interested in the quality of the construction of this building versus University Village, because I perceive, I don't know this for sure, but this is a fairly high quality building that they, you know, as you compare it to some of the other buildings that have been built on campus recently, this looks like a pretty well constructed one. I maybe don't have the same opinion of University Village, and I'm just curious about what do we know about the Weedham Foundation and why they find this in their mission to build on our campus.
Do either of you want to try to answer that question, Senior Vice President Bertelson? I keep promoting you.
I appreciate the thought, but I don't. I think I'll leave that to my boss. Mr. Chair, Regent Lucas, I can't speak exactly to the origin of what was in their spirit. I did spend some time looking at their mission, which is pretty generic to say advancing the spirit of donations of their founding family member. So it didn't really get into any mission topic other than the spirit of giving. They have 3 residence halls, apartment buildings and related to colleges, 1 in St. Cloud and 2 here, both which you mentioned. And then they have a number of memory care units across the state. So I don't quite understand the portfolio plan for that, so I can't really speak to that. We did hear that they're interested in divesting themselves of the housing. At least, I don't know about the St. Cloud one, but at least the 2 that are here. And so there's this, and in this particular one, because of the location especially, it's right across from 17th Avenue. It's right in the core, and we own land on each side of it, almost surrounding this facility. It made sense for us from a land purchase. To your question about the construction quality, I probably don't have a lot of details about that, but I guess in general, I'd say it's not necessarily built exactly the same standard that the university housing is on campus, where we're building for a much longer term. It was a development plan, but it is built from we did a facility condition review as part of the due diligence, and would agree that it's better than some other private stuff, which is more just seem to maybe have a more of a speedy kind of build. This one feels to have a more depth and substance to it, and we have some experience with people leasing space in it, so we have a sense of how the building is operating. So I'd agree that it's on the relative scale, it's better than some of the other ones, and so that played into the decision as well.
Thank you.
Regent McMillan.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. Question for, well, first of all, I'm supportive, and I appreciate, as I put some context around this coming out of our former facilities committee, and you began to utilize master leases in a much bigger sense. Provide me and the rest of the board with some context around, how you see master leases continuing, whether this kind of thing is opportunistic, if there's more of it. I believe we have another master lease that was at Radius. It looks like a great way to go out, get to know about a building, understand it, and then when the opportunity arises, turn it into an owned asset. So I'm curious how you're looking at this, whether this is something that would only happen when the seller or the lessor is interested, or whether we're going to try to, make a habit of more of these master leases.
Mr. Chair, Regent McMillan, you're exactly right that we have the 2 master leases, both for Radius and Keeler, and that was our plan going into it. We weren't entering those with the anticipation of leading so quickly to a purchase. That really was not on the table so much in the conversation when we started it, but it was a shift in the owner of Keeler that led to this particular moment. We believe that this is our first big foray of the size, and Radius is a very much larger facility. So so far it's been going well. We're learning through what that's like to have someone else own the building and for us to operate it. It fits within the direction that we have from you as a board as to the volume of housing we have and how much of that housing need for the student body we should provide for first year, second years transfers. This is sort of our way to ease into an potentially could be a long-term strategy as we think about expanding the second year plan for adding housing for more second year. That might, as opposed to trying to own all of that portfolio, that might be a transition from owned first year residence halls to more apartment buildings, which there's much more in the private sector. So I think that could be part of our strategy, and we hope to, in this first year as we go through it, we're going to review how it went, what we think about it, and we'll continue to do that. And we'll reevaluate then our overall size of portfolio and how many students we're addressing as Pioneer opens up in another year and a half.
Good. Follow up?
Oh, go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Chair Anderson, and thank you for that answer. I sure hope we keep master leases in the toolkit, and they look like a really flexible, and in this case, a great way to access and own property. Detailed question, what's the rest of that little odd-shaped block over there that shows up on our map? Is that a collection of other buildings that have ground leases with us, or what do we have there? Just out of curiosity.
So, Chair Anderson, Regent McMillan, to the west of the property is a lot. I believe it is a parking lot that we own.
Yeah, I think what you're talking about, the hashed part of the building.
It looks like there's another building connected.
So the property, the ground lease does include some of the space just outside of the building. So that's a drive on that side of the building. So we wanted to represent the whole size of the ground lease relative to the building.
Okay, I know we got another speaker, but I'm going to take my priority and just editorialize a little because it fits on there. When I looked at this, as a person who comes from small business, I look at it and I thought, this is kind of a good deal. Our board has asked to increase students. We've asked to increase transfer students. We've asked to increase the number that live in university housing. I think this gives us a good blended rate, if you will, of dormitory pricing, apartment pricing that we control. And I think that helps us control some of that pricing, the lower cost we're getting on buying a quote-unquote used building rather than building new. I think it fits in the model we want, and I very much agree with that. So that would be my take on this. In that respect, Student Representative Keon has a question.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. As a resident and also community advisor that lives and works in Keeler Apartments, I think that a lot of our concerns with the management of the building will be addressed by us owning the property. But one concern that I do have is the flooding issue that happens on the second floor. I was wondering if in your analysis of this building you've come up with an address to that problem, because it is kind of constant.
There wasn't aware of a flooding issue on the second floor. Vice President Bertelsen, you want to...
Chair Anderson, yes, we are aware of that. So, and we have done some facility review of trying to identify the causes of it. And the capital planning folks are, as soon as we are working on the solution to try to address it. There are some, we believe it's a targeted, potentially a plumbing fix, and not a, but there are solutions. There are people working on the solution. So I guess that's probably the best.
Go ahead, yeah. Ms. Keon.
What about the accessibility of internet in the building? Because it currently doesn't work all the time. And so would we be able to expand university Wi-Fi to encompass that zone as well? Or will we try to improve the Ethernet capabilities of the building itself?
Vice President Bertelsen.
Nothing like having an insider at the topic.
Yeah.
That's a good question. I'll have to check on that one. I don't know. Generally, our approach of things that we would own, I would imagine we will try to we'll certainly try to address that. I don't know the means to do so.
Would it be your belief, Vice President Bertelson, that the plumbing issue and the internet issue will be up to university standards in a short
reasonable time? Yes, I think I can say that.
Okay. Thank you. Vice President Burdette, did you want to? No. Any other discussion? I don't think I. Regent Lucas again? Okay, Regent Lucas.
Thank you. Just a quick question. I understand that Keeler does not pay property tax because of the fact that it's owned by a foundation and a nonprofit, but Radius paid property tax, and now because we're leasing it, they're still paying property tax? Or how does that whole property tax issue feed into this analysis of whether we own or lease?
Regent Anderson, Regent Lucas, we'll have to get that information for you. Typically, the tax exempt nature of it follows the predominant use of the building, and I would have to find out when we took over master leasing it, how that was addressed with the city and what the rationale was. We will find out and get back to you by tomorrow morning.
Thank you.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman?
Regent Johnson.
My Norwegian curiosity has me asking this question. If there's flooding on the second floor, what about the first floor?
Student Representative Kiana is shaking her head, so it must be an isolated incident. Okay, we do have a motion on the floor. We talked about it. Is there any further discussion? I'm going to ask you to vote in just a moment on buying the Keeler apartment building. So that is what we will be voting on. Entertain a motion. I've got the motion. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion passes. Let's see I turn the page. Capital budget amendment on the, I understand, remember this, the wrestling practice facility. I think we're going to have Vice President Bitters and Athletic Director Coyle is making his, if he's here, he'd be making his way up front.
Members, as they tee up if I can, Mr. Chairman, we're on page 184 of your docket. This is a capital budget amendment, and the athletics and capital planning will discuss the approval of this wrestling facility with private money.
Okay. Are we? It is a review item today, I believe. It is a review item today, and they're getting approached. It's doing the ball.
Why keeps doing that? I got it. I think so.
Okay, we'll just wait a minute while they're getting set up. Well, here we go.
That's forward. I don't.
I'm going to ask you, gentlemen, if you can go through the presentation fairly quickly and get us back on schedule. So I don't know who's leading, but you're welcome to go forward.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, committee members. Bruce Gooders, Capital Planning and Project Management. I have interim university architect Mark Partridge up here with me in case my voice doesn't hold for the rest of this presentation, but we'll try to keep it brief. Today, again, we have a capital budget amendment request. This is a good news story. We have Athletic Director Mark Coyle to give you an overview of the project rationale, and then I'll give you a brief project description.
Athletic Director Coyle.
Okay, Chair Anderson, yeah, so this is a repurposing of the existing space in Bierman. As you know, Athletes Village was completed and we've moved in, and so this has created new space for some of our other programs. So our goal is to repurpose this existing space and help our wrestling program get up to speed with our peers in the Big Ten with respect to facilities for training and usage for our student athletes.
And again, this project is a good news project that recently received funding by a private donor. As Mark indicated, the project moves the wrestling practice room from the basement of the Bierman building to the fourth floor gymnasium in Bierman that was vacated by the basketball group when they moved into the new Athletes Village facility. And what you're looking at right now is an image of the new wrestling space, including an upper mezzanine for the coaches in recruiting. This project will improve practice facilities and spaces to develop student athletes for the Gophers wrestling team. The trainer and the cardio room will be adjacent to the gym on the main floor. On the upper mezzanine, the wrestling coaches' offices will be adjacent to the practice facility while enhancing the ability to recruit and retain top talent in the program. Again, donor funds make this project a reality. The cost estimate is $2.2 million for construction, $400,000 for non-construction funds, fully funded by private giving. This project is on schedule with design completion slated for the end of this month or early March, and occupancy in November of this year. And finally, the annual operating costs, there will be no net change to the existing operating costs in the Bierman facility. Thank you. Any questions?
Okay, that is the presentation. It's up for review this month. Are there any questions?
Mr. Chairman?
Regent Johnson.
Mr. Chairman, first of all, thanks to Mr. Coyle and his team for the fundraising effort in this endeavor. Much appreciated. Second of all, I know this is up for review, and I would put it before my fellow regents this way. I would move that we take action this month, but if there's objection for whatever reason, I would not make that motion. But I think everything's in place, the fundraising's in place, the planning's in place, and why wait till March or May to do that? So I see some nods around the table, so I would make the motion on the wrestling facility that we move forward this month. And I know it violates this review and action, but I think this has we're well planned and well positioned in this regard. So I'd make that motion.
It hasn't been moved. If it's seconded, we can put it on the floor in discussion.
Second.
There's a second from Regent Hsu. Okay, now it's open for discussion. Is there any discussion on the wrestling project? I have a question. So my question comes, somebody didn't just walk into your office and hand you a check. Is this part of going out and soliciting for Athletes Village, and people say that, you know, I really like the Athletes Village and stuff, but I really have a heart for wrestling, or I have a heart for baseball, I'd like to do something. Can you tell us, to the extent that the donor doesn't mind, how this came about?
Yeah, so Chair Anderson, each one of our 25 sports programs has developed great and unique relationships with people who are very passionate about those specific sports. And these two individuals had a strong connection with our wrestling program, with Coach Eggum, Coach Becker, and that staff. And with Athletes Village being done, we had a chance to visit with these individuals who wish to remain anonymous, and they were kind enough to make the gift to make the facility a reality for us.
Terrific. I see there's a question, Regent Omari.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. Two questions. First one is, what will we do with the space that's currently the wrestling facility? And then the second question is this towards the total number that we said Athletes Village would cost, or will that number now go up by $2.6 million?
Okay. Chair Anderson and Regent Omari, the existing space, so when we were able to move our programs into Athletes Village, that's going to create a chain reaction, if you will. And so, for example, our softball program is going to move out of their current locker room and move into the old football locker room. Baseball team's going to move out of their locker room, also move into the old football team locker room. We'll obviously do renovations. So all of our sports will get enhanced locker room space, team meeting space, with the Gibson-Nursky side becoming available. We'll do the same thing with wrestling. We'll repurpose that for other sports to utilize that facility. And then with respect to our overall goal of fundraising, as you know, the Athletes Village project is a $166 million facility. We have, with the track, another $19 million. We had some renovations to 3M Arena at Mariucci with the locker room for the men's hockey program, the weight room. We have some renovations to some other sports. So this money is part of that, and towards that goal, we're at about $122 million overall towards our goal of fundraising for everything involved in that process.
So that number, Mr. Chair, that number is still $166 million.
Yes, sir. Yeah, yes, sir.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Regent Lucas.
Thank you, Chair. I just have a couple questions about the other Olympic sports that still need attention, and I'm thinking particularly of gymnastics and I think volleyball.
Chair Anderson and Regent Lucas, we are in the process right now of doing a feasibility study with our gymnastics programs. They are both in desperate need of space for training for our student athletes and practice facilities, and working closely with Vice President Burnett and his office on that, and identifying options for that. And then with respect to volleyball, we are working closely. As you know, we have a volleyball program that's been to back-to-back Final Fours, the Sweet 16 this year, a national program that competes at a national level, and we're looking at Maturity Pavilion and some of the renovations we can do there, about a potential volleyball performance center, and some of those things that we work closely with Coach McCutcheon on. So those are all steps that we're gathering information on as we continue to build our program.
And this will be added to the amount that we need to raise totally?
That is correct.
It's not baked in?
That is correct.
Thank you.
Regent McMillan had a question.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. As someone who believes heavily in the value for good governance of doing this in a step-by-step process, if we're going to accelerate and do the approval today rather than our traditional mode, and I appreciate why we do that. Sometimes it'd be helpful to just know that there's advantage to doing that, because the community feedback, the stakeholder feedback process, the opportunity for the board to digest with the review and then action is always good. I don't mind going around it here, but I'd like to know there's value to doing that, so we don't, miss something that could just as well wait till March. But if there's value, I'm willing to bend.
Okay, Chair Anderson and Regent McMillan, thank you for the question. I think, as you know, there's always a sense of urgency with athletics, and if you can start now, we can start. That space is currently open. To be honest with you, sir, I don't know what impact there would be on a delay, so I don't want to give you false information, but I do know that space is now free and vacant, so we could move forward if given approval sooner.
I will also say the request for action did not come from the athletics department. It came from Regent Johnson. So I just think that's proper to make note of.
Thank you.
We have that motion on the table to take our funded remodel of the wrestling program and okay it. I'm going to ask for the vote at this time. That's what the motion does. It's $2.6 million. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And now we're going to ask that we've got actually 3 collective bargaining reports coming up in a row. I believe Vice President Brown is going to present them in less than, while she's coming up. Senior Vice President Burnett may want to tee them up.
As Vice President Brown comes for the next 3 collective bargaining agreements, I just want to take this opportunity in front of the board to thank Vice President Brown, Patty Dion, and the team, all the work that they've done to bring in these labor negotiation contracts within budget, continue to very hard work, and I think do high compliments from this board and from the administration for the work you've done and the work that's sitting before you today for you to take action. Thank you.
Vice President Brown, you may proceed when ready.
Yes, Chair Anderson, members of the committee, I'm actually going to allow Patty Dion, our Senior Director for Employee Relations, to present these 3 labor contracts, and I echo Senior Vice President Burnett's compliments to she and her team. They've been just extraordinary in their efforts to get these done.
Okay, go ahead if you will.
Chair Anderson, Senior Vice President Burnett, and members of the committee, we are pleased to bring to you today for your approval the labor agreement, first labor agreement here that we have negotiated with the Clerical employee group. That is a group that is represented by AFSCME, the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. There are 1,700 employees in this unit, and these employees work on all of our campuses and on our research outreach centers. This is a 2-year contract, covers the time period from July 1st, 2017 through June 30th, 2019. And this is a mature contract. AFSCME has represented the clerical employees for at least 25 years. And so this settlement here is pretty straightforward. The negotiations focus primarily on wages. Our settlement consists of a 2% salary pool in each of the 2 years. Employees in this unit receive pay in 2 ways. One is by the pay scale movement, and the other is by employees moving through that pay scale through a series of step increases. So our settlement for this group is in each year of the contract to move the pay scale by 1.5%, and then to also provide for the cost of those progression increases, and the cost of those increases is 0.5%. There were a few agreements regarding language. We agreed to continue to meet regarding issues related to a respectful workplace, and we updated our language regarding prohibited discrimination to include gender identity and gender expression, and this is to be consistent with our university-wide policies. So with that, we ask for your approval of this labor agreement. Thank you.
At this time, I'll entertain a motion to recommend approval of the resolution related to the proposed legal agreement with AFSCME Local 3800 and 3801 Clerical and Office Unit.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Second's been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion?
Chair Anderson and members of the committee, I would like to recognize that some members of that unit are present today, and we'd like to thank them very much. Their leadership, they've been good to work with, and we look forward to our continuing good relations with them.
I would like to thank them for their work for the University of Minnesota. So thank you. It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. We now have the collective bargaining agreement for the Graphic Communications Conference of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, Local 1M.
So Chair Anderson, Senior Vice President Burnett, and members of the committee, again, we are pleased to bring today for your approval the labor agreement that we've negotiated with the Trades Printing Group. And this is a group represented by the Graphic Communications Conference of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. That's kind of a mouthful, isn't it? There are 7 employees in this group, and they all work in the Twin Cities campus printing plant. This is a 3-year contract, which covers the time period from November 1st, 2017 through October 31st, 2020. Our relationship with this union as well goes back many years, and so again, this contract negotiation focused primarily on wages. In the first and second years of this agreement, the salary range and the employee's salary will be adjusted by 2%. All of the employees are at the top of this range. It's a very short range, and so there are no step increases. This again is equivalent to the wage parameters for our other employee groups. In the third year of this agreement, we have agreed to adjust the wages by the same amount as will be determined by the civil service employee group. And so again, we ask for your approval of this labor agreement.
Thank you. At this time, I'll entertain a motion to recommend approval of the resolution related to the proposed labor agreement with the Graphic Communications Conference of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, Local 1M. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Regent Chu, is there a second?
Second.
There's a second. The motion is on the table. It's been obtained and seconded. Is there any discussion? Regent Chu.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. Just a quick question relating back to the $15 an hour wage. Is this the contract that you were referring to earlier?
Next one.
Next one.
Oh, the next one.
Regent
Okay.
Chu, I could speak to that for a few minutes in the Teamster contract, the next one.
Okay.
Is that okay, Regent Chu? Okay. So we're going to vote on this, the proposal for the International Brotherhood of Teamsters Local 1M. All those in favor of the agreement signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. So we will now move on to the collective bargaining agreement with Teamsters Local 320, Service Maintenance and Labor Union. Ladies.
Chair Anderson, Senior Vice President Burnett, members of the committee, we are very pleased to bring to you today for your approval the labor agreement that we have negotiated with the Teamsters, and want to, before I go through all of the pieces that I want to present to you, thank also the members of the Teamster unit and the Teamster negotiating committee for hanging in there and working with us through some very tough issues for both parties. There are 1,500 employees in this unit, and these employees also work on all of our campuses in our research and outreach centers. This is a 2-year contract as well, and it covers the time period from July 1st, 2017 through June 30th, 2019. Again, our settlement consists of a 2% salary pool in each of the 2 years. Again, employees in this unit receive their pay in 2 different ways. One is through a movement of the wage scale, and one is through progressing through the range through step increases. Our final contract will include the following. The pay scales with employees at the top step will have that top step increase by 2% in each year, and those employees at the top step will receive a 2% increase. No other adjustments will be made to the pay range. So the current pay ranges, other than the top step, stay in place. Employees within the range will continue to receive their step increases to move through that range on their anniversary date, and they will also receive a $300 lump sum. This was a more complicated financial settlement than our other contracts, but we had worked through many meetings to try to address the issues that each party had in an attempt to find a settlement that could be agreeable to both parties, still falling within that 2% parameter that we have for this employee group. Now, in addition to, we reached an agreement to phase in a plan over the 2-year agreement to move our entry-level wage rates to the $15 an hour that we currently have for all of our other employee groups. We have about 150 employees who would be impacted by moving to that $15 an hour. Again, we're phasing that in over the course of the 2 years. So at the beginning of the second year, roughly July 1st of 2018, the employees will move, who are below $15 an hour, will move halfway to that $15 an hour. And at the end of that second year, they will move to, their wages will move up to the $15. So that's a way for us to accommodate, obviously, the cost to this, but still reach our goal of having that $15 an hour comparable to all of our other employee groups. There were also a number of language issues that we were able to address and agreed to meet and confer to resolve outstanding issues related to such things as holiday pay and new employee orientation. I'll say again, this was a challenging negotiation for both parties, and we are pleased we were able to reach an agreement. So we ask for your approval of this labor agreement.
Thank you. With that, I will entertain a motion to recommend approval of the resolution related to the proposed labor agreement with Teamsters Local 320 Service, Maintenance, and Labor Unit. Is there a motion? So moved. Is there a second?
Second.
Second. It's been moved and seconded to this motion for this agreement. Although, is there any discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you very much. And we're going to move on to the consent report. Before I go anywhere with it, I am going to, in just a moment, I'm going to have President Keeler, if you'd hold off a second, speak on the appointment of a new chancellor in Rochester. But before he does that, I'll entertain a motion to recommend approval of the revised consent report as appears in the materials.
So moved.
Is there a second? Second. Okay, so we've got it moved and seconded, and we'll have discussion if there is any. Prior to the discussion, President Keeler, would you like to talk about the new chancellor at Rochester?
I would be delighted to do that, Regent Anderson. Thank you. I am seeking this committee's recommendation for full board approval for the appointment of Dr. Lori Carroll as Chancellor of the University of Minnesota Rochester. I'm confident that she will provide strong leadership for UMR's unparalleled education in the health sciences, including its integrated hands-on curriculum, personalized attention, and innovative learning experience in our dynamic Rochester location. As you know, the Chancellor of UMR is the Chief Executive Officer of the campus, reporting directly to me, the President of the University. As the Chief Executive Officer of the Rochester campus, the Chancellor is responsible for academic, executive, and administrative leadership of the campus. The Chancellor is also charged with facilitating, nurturing, coordinating, and supporting efforts of the administration, students, faculty, and staff on the Rochester campus, and with carrying out campus and university's policies and procedures. The Chancellor represents UMR to the university, the community, the region, the legislature, and public and private sectors. And Dr. Carroll, UMR will have a tireless advocate who's known to the UMR committee and just the community, and just as importantly to the entire Rochester community. Besides recently serving so admirably as UMR's interim chancellor, since 2014 was UMR's vice chancellor for academic affairs and student development. In that role, she was deeply involved with, among other things, UMR's strategic fiscal, facilities, and enrollment planning, its integrative planning in the downtown Rochester community, growing the living learning communities, and she's been instrumental in developing the Higher Education Innovation Summit plan for this coming June. Without hesitation, I enthusiastically ask your recommendation to the full board that Lori Carroll be appointed as the next Chancellor of the University of Minnesota, Rochester.
Thank you, President Keeler. And colleagues, that's one of the items in the consent report that we will be voting on. Is there any discussion on the consent report? Regent Hsu.
Thank you, Chair Anderson. Regarding the first item, the two Friends and Neighbors Human Inc., are we approving a $2 million contract today, or does it include all of the other options that gets it up to $10 million?
I don't have the, I read it, this Vice President Kramer is going to come up and try to answer that. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, Regent Hsu, it is for 1 year. This is our marketing budget with an option to renew in the second year.
Regent Hsu.
Vice President Kramer, so thank you for that answer. So does this, when you say this is our marketing budget, does this include the actual purchase of advertising as well as creative, or is there another component that...
Vice President Kramer?
Mr. Chairman, Regent Hsu, it's a combination, and I'd like to ask our Chief Marketing Officer, Ann Aronson, to offer more specificity.
Chair Anderson, hi. Regent Hsu, yes, it covers media, all media costs, production, and creative and agency time.
Regent Hsu.
So it includes airtime and all that stuff as well? Okay.
Yes.
So, yeah, so that's, based on what I've seen on TV, if we're only spending $2 million a year, we're getting a lot of airtime, unless...
It's actually for 12 weeks a year, so we could do with a lot more. But
is there any other discussion on this or any other items? It appears that on this item, it's an annual cost with about a 5-year contract that we can void if we want to. That's what it appears to me.
Yes.
Options, okay. Thank you. So that's what it appears. Like affirmative heads say that's what it is. Any other discussion on the consent agenda? If not, I'll call for a vote. All those in favor of accepting the consent agenda, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Consent agenda passes. Thank you, people. I don't really have anything else. Senior Vice President Burnett says information items can wait, or you can talk to him, or there's nothing absolutely pressing he has to talk about. So if that is true, I will move for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Adjourned.
Really appreciate your comment.
The board. 2 minutes. Oh, this is the 11th. The first one took us long.